She pressed her forehead against the porch post and counted to 10 in French, the only thing left in the world that still felt like hers. Behind her, she heard him push back his chair. She pulled her son closer without turning around. 8 years old, and James already knew to stay quiet. That was the morning Clara Aldridge finally stopped waiting for someone to come. And that was exactly the morning Colt Briggs rode into Cedar Ridge and refused to look away. If this story already reached your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow every part to the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far Clara's story travels. Summer had come hard to Cedar Ridge that year. The mountains around town held onto their snowcaps deep into June, but by the time July arrived, the heat pressed down through the pine canopy like a flat iron, and the creek at the edge of Main Street ran slow and brown and tired. Everything in Cedar Ridge felt tired. The storefronts, the fences, the faces of the men who'd been working the same land for 30 years without getting ahead. Tired and quiet and unwilling to be disturbed, which was exactly why nobody said a word about what happened every morning on the porch of the Aldridge house. The house sat at the near end of Sycamore Lane, close enough to Main Street that you could hear the general store's screen door slap shut from the front yard. It was a respectable-looking house, or it had been once whitewashed boards that had yellowed to the color of old teeth, a porch that sagged on the left side, a garden that Clara Aldridge tried every spring to bring back, and that her husband destroyed every summer just by walking through it without caring. Roses she'd planted the first year of her marriage had never bloomed. She'd stopped expecting them to. Clara was 34 years old and looked closer to 45. Not because she was ugly, she wasn't, not even close. She had the kind of face that photographs well in better circumstances, brown eyes that held onto light longer than they should have, cheekbones that her mother had once called aristocratic before everything in their family went sideways. But 2 years of widowhood followed by 18 of Denton Aldridge had done what poverty and grief and hard frontier living did to a woman who had no one standing between her and the worst of it. She moved carefully. She chose her words carefully. She kept her son, 8-year-old James, standing slightly behind her whenever Denton was home. Denton Aldridge was not Clara's husband. He was her late husband's older brother, and under the terms of a will that Clara had never been shown in full, she and James had been declared dependents of the Aldridge estate, which meant Denton's estate, which meant Denton's house. Denton's rules, Denton's hands, whenever he felt the world hadn't given him enough respect that day. The arrangement had started 6 months after Thomas Aldridge died of a fever in the winter of 1881. Denton had arrived with a lawyer and a document and a tone that said the conversation was already over. Clara had signed because James was 4 years old, and she had $11 and no family within 300 miles. She had told herself it was temporary. She had been telling herself that ever since. That July morning, the morning Colt Briggs first rode into Cedar Ridge, had begun the same way most mornings began in the Aldridge house. Denton had come home from the saloon the night before in a state which was not unusual. He had slept poorly, which was not unusual. He had woken with a headache and a grievance he couldn't quite name, which was very usual. Clara had been up since 5, had made coffee, had kept James quiet in his room with a picture book and strict instructions not to come downstairs until she called him. She had learned the rhythms of the household, the way a ship's cook learns a storm, the early signs, the specific quality of Denton's footsteps on the stairs, the way his jaw moved when he was just irritable versus when he was looking for a reason. That morning, he had been looking for a reason. The coffee was too hot, and then it was too cold. Eggs were wrong. The bread was stale, even though she'd baked it the day before. She had answered too quickly, and then she'd waited too long to answer. She had looked at him, and then she'd looked away, and neither was right. Each complaint was a step in a sequence she recognized and could not stop. She'd tried once to leave the room before it reached the end of the sequence. It had made things worse. Now she stayed. She absorbed it. She kept her face still and her hands flat on the table, and she waited. When his hand came across the side of her face, she turned with it. She'd learned that too. She didn't make a sound. James was upstairs. Go clean something, Denton said, and went back to his coffee, like he'd done nothing more consequential than swat a fly. Clara went to the porch. She stood with one hand on the post and pressed her forehead against the wood and breathed. Out on Sycamore Lane, a mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire in a cottonwood tree, cycling through 5 different songs in under a minute, cheerful and oblivious. A wagon creaked past. The driver didn't look toward the house. Nobody on Sycamore Lane looked toward the house. That was the agreement, though no one had ever said it out loud. Cedar Ridge was a town that valued its peace, and peace, in Cedar Ridge, was nobody having to deal with anything uncomfortable. Clara pressed her forehead harder against the post and counted to 10 in French. It was something her schoolteacher grandmother had taught her when she was very small, and she'd kept the habit through everything. Un, trois, the mockingbird switched songs, Cotter. Nank 6, the wagon was gone, sept huit neuf. She reached 10 and started over. She was on her second round of counting when she heard the horse. Not the usual sound of Cedar Ridge horses, the slow plodding of animals that had done the same routes so many times they could do them half asleep. This was different, a bigger animal, moving at an unhurried but purposeful pace, shod hooves on packed dirt, making a sound that was somehow both quiet and carrying. Clara didn't look up at first. She was still counting. The voice was low, not loud, not demanding. Just there, like a hand placed carefully on a table. She looked up. The man on the horse was tall, even sitting down, the kind of tall that you register in your bones before your eyes confirm it. He'd stopped his horse at the edge of the lane, not right in front of the house, intruding. Just stopped. He had dark hair gone partly silver at the temples, a short beard that was more dark than gray, and a face that had been worked on by years of outdoor living into something that wasn't exactly handsome, but was absolutely worth looking at. He wore a leather vest over a dark shirt and a hat that had been a good hat a long time ago and was still better than most. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to realize what was strange about it. He was looking directly at her, not past her, not around her. Not with the particular careful blankness that Cedar Ridge had perfected in all its dealings with the situation at the Aldridge house. He was looking at her face, at the side that Denton had caught, and his expression was not pity. Not outrage. Something quieter and more solid than either of those. Something that said, I see what I see, and I am not going to pretend I don't. You all right? He said. 2 words. Quiet enough that Denton, inside the house, wouldn't hear them. Clara straightened up from the post. Her hand came away from it, and she folded both hands in front of her in the posture she'd developed for public, the one that suggested composure. I'm fine, she said, thank you. He nodded. He didn't move. The horse shifted its weight slightly, and he steadied it with one hand, easy and automatic, not breaking his attention. New to town, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Or, she said, yes, she could see that he was. Cedar Ridge knew all its own horses, and it knew none of its own people who sat a horse like that, like the animals was an extension of their thinking rather than a tool they were operating. Old Briggs, he said, I've got the Harlan property. Up the North Ridge, the Harlan property. Clara knew of it vaguely, a mountain ranch that had sat empty for 2 seasons after old Grant Harlan died without heirs. Whoever had bought it had been quiet about it. Cedar Ridge had speculated, lost interest, moved on to speculating about other things. Clara Aldridge, she said, and then, because it was Cedar Ridge and he'd know soon enough, the widow Aldridge. People will tell you that. Something shifted in his expression. Reckon they'll tell me all kinds of things, he said. I generally let people finish before I decide what to think. From inside the house, Denton's voice came through the screen door, not words, just that particular tone that meant he'd noticed she wasn't in the kitchen anymore. Colt Briggs heard it. She could tell by the slight change in how he held himself. He looked at the screen door for one moment, then back at her. I'll be in town a while, he said, getting supplies. Needing to know the people, he touched the brim of his hat, a real gesture, not a reflex, and clicked his horse forward. Good morning to you, Mrs. Aldridge. He wrote on. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go, and for the first time in longer than she could specifically remember, she forgot to count. The thing about Cedar Ridge was that it had not always been unkind. In Thomas Aldridge's time, when Clara had first come to this part of Colorado as a new bride of 22, with a carpetbag and a set of good intentions, town had been not warm, exactly. It towns didn't run to warmth but fair. People said good morning and meant it. The women brought food when someone was sick. The men helped rebuild when a fence came down. There was a church with a decent choir, and a schoolhouse with a decent teacher, and enough of the ordinary markers of civilization that Clara had thought, yes, is a place where a life can be built. Thomas had been a good man. She had loved him the way you love something you've chosen carefully and are proud of choosing. He wasn't exciting, he was steady, and steady was what she'd wanted. He worked hard, he talked about things, he thought her opinions were worth having. He died, and the world became a place she didn't recognize. The grief had come first, enormous and shapeless, then the practical emergency of being a widow with a small child and no particular skills beyond running a household and a fine hand with a needle. Denton, arriving like a weather system, and everything else. Cedar Ridge had watched the transition, with the expression of a town that has decided that something is not its business. The widow Aldridge's situation was considered, if it was considered at all, to be a private family matter. Denton Aldridge was not a pleasant man, but he was a man who paid his bills and kept up appearances and showed up to church on alternate Sundays, and in Cedar Ridge those things counted for something. Nay, the marks he left on Clara were generally in places that clothing covered, or were on her face only in the early mornings before the town was fully awake. By the time the general store opened and the post office unlocked its doors, Clara had had time to arrange herself. The exception was Mabel Pruitt, who ran the dry goods counter at Caldwell's general store, and who had, several months ago, looked at Clara's wrist across the counter and said quietly, "Clara, you can tell me if things aren't right." Clara had smiled her composed smile and said, "Things are fine, Mabel." "Thank you." And Mabel had looked like she wanted to say more, and then she'd wrapped up the flowers and the sugar and let it go, and they had not spoken of it again. What else could Mabel do? What could any of them do? Denton hadn't broken any laws that anyone could prove, and getting involved in a family matter in a small town in 1883 was an invitation to make enemies of people you had to live next to for the rest of your life. Cedar Ridge looked the other way, and Clara had stopped expecting anything different. Colt Briggs spent the morning at Caldwell's general store acquiring what he needed for the ranch, a significant list given 2 seasons of vacancy and letting the town acquire him. He'd been doing this all his life, moving into new places, and he knew exactly how it worked. Went where people gathered. You were polite. You asked questions and listened to the answers. You did not volunteer information. By noon, the people in a town like Cedar Ridge would know everything they'd decided they needed to know about you, and you'd know more about them than they realized they'd told you. By noon, he knew quite a bit about Clara Aldridge. He knew it from the way Mabel Pruitt at the counter hesitated for just a fraction of a second when he meant having passed by Sycamore Lane that morning and seen a woman on a porch who'd directed him toward the store. He knew it from the way 2 men near the back of the store suddenly became very interested in examining a rack of harness leather. Knew it from what Mabel said, which was, "That'd be Clara." Widow Aldridge. She's Denton Aldridge's household. The pause before Denton's name. The slight careful quality of the word household. "Aldridge," he said. "Dark coat?" "That's Denton," Mabel said. He was in earlier. "The woman looked like she'd had a hard morning," Colt said. He kept his voice even, observational, not accusatory. Silence in the store rearranged itself. "Clara has hard mornings sometimes," Mabel said. She was looking at the counter. It's a difficult situation." "I imagine it is," Colt said. He paid for his supplies, loaded his wagon, and went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Walt Greer was a man in his mid-50s who had the look of someone who'd made a large number of reasonable compromises over the course of a career and was living with the accumulated weight of all of them. He was agreeable enough. He told Colt about the road up to the Harlan property, about the property lines that sometimes got disputed with the Mackey Ranch to the east, about the water rights on the North Creek that had been a point of contention until they weren't. He did not bring up the Aldridge situation. Colt did. "I rode past the Aldridge place this morning," he said, "and saw a woman on the porch. Clara Aldridge," Greer said. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. "She had a mark on her face," Colt said. "Left cheek." Greer turned the pen. "Like I said," he said, "Denton Aldridge has his Denton runs a tight household." "Right," Colt said. "It's a private family matter," Greer said. He set down the pen. "Mr. Briggs, I understand you're new here, and I understand you come from wherever it is you come from with your own ideas about things. Cedar Ridge is a peaceable town. We keep it that way by not inserting ourselves into situations that aren't our business. A woman getting struck in her own home, Colt said, is somebody's business." Greer looked at him steadily. "She hasn't complained." "I wonder why." The two men looked at each other for a moment. It was not an unfriendly look exactly. It was the look of two people who understand that they disagree about something fundamental and have not yet determined how consequential that disagreement is going to be. "You're going to be a neighbor to this community for a good while," Greer said. "I'd encourage you to let people handle their own affairs." Colt stood, picked up his hat. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," he said. He did not say he would let people handle their own affairs. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Not in front of the house. He wasn't looking to create a scene. But Cedar Ridge was a town you rode through on the way to the North Ridge Road, and the North Ridge Road took you past the end of Sycamore Lane, and the end of Sycamore Lane had a sight line to the Aldridge Port. It didn't stop the first 2 mornings. He looked. He noted. He rode on and went up to the ranch and worked from sunup to dark on everything that 2 years of abandonment had done to the Harlan property, which was considerable. On the 3rd morning he was coming down from the ridge earlier than usual. He'd run out of fence wire and needed to go back into town when he heard the sound. He heard it from 40 yards away, and his horse heard it too, because the animal's ears went forward, and it shifted under him with the specific discomfort of a creature that has registered something wrong. It was a boy's voice, trying hard not to be loud and failing. Colt rode toward it without deciding to. The boy was in the side yard of the Aldridge house, pressed against the fence slats, and he was 8 or 9 years old and had Clara's eyes the same light-holding brown, and he was clearly trying not to cry, and not quite succeeding. He had a split on his lower lip that hadn't been there from a fall. Eighth stopped his horse and looked at the boy and at the split lip and then at the house. "Hey," he said quietly. The boy, startled, looked up at him. Tried to compose his face into something dignified and achieved something that was heartbreaking instead. "You okay?" "Yes, sir," the boy said immediately. Looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. The boy's lower lip trembled. "No, sir. What's your name?" "James. I'm Colt." He swung down from the horse. Crouched to the boy's eye level. "Where's your mama?" "Inside," James said. "Uncle Denton's he's not happy today." "Mama told me to come outside." "Did he do that?" Colt asked. Indicated the lip with a slight movement of his head. James pressed his mouth together, 8 years old and already knowing how to protect his family's secrets. "I fell," he said. Colt didn't push it. "James," he said, "I'm going to go knock on that front door." "You stay here, all right? You stay right here." Something complicated moved through the boy's face. Hope and terror and a desperate craving for someone bigger than himself to handle something he'd been watching his mother handle alone for a long time. "He's real mad today," James whispered. "I know," Colt said. "Stay here." He went to the front door and he knocked. There was a silence inside the house, the specific silence of a household that has been caught mid-something and is rearranging itself. Then footsteps, heavy ones, Denton's boots on the floorboards, and the door swung open. Denton Aldridge was in his mid-50s, going soft around the middle, with a red complexion and the slightly pushed-in look of a man who'd had too much of everything good and still felt cheated. He looked at Colt with the initial assessment of a man who is always measuring whether someone is a threat to his authority. Denton said. "Morning," Colt said. "Colt Briggs. I've got the Harlan property up the North Ridge. Just coming through on my way to town." "Good for you," Denton said. "I wanted to introduce myself to the neighbors," Colt said. Neighborly thing to do. Denton looked him over. The assessment shifted slightly. Colt was bigger than Denton, and Denton was the kind of man who noticed that. "Denton Aldridge," he said, with the flat automatic delivery of someone who says their own name as a form of warning. "I know," Colt said pleasantly. "Actually, I was hoping to speak to Mrs. Aldridge." Something moved through Denton's face. Not anger yet, just a tightening. "About what, my household," Colt said. "I'm looking for someone who might do some mending and repair work. Someone in town recommended her, said she's handy with a needle." It was not a lie. Mabel Pruitt had mentioned the day before, offhand, that Clara had had a small mending business in the early years of her widowhood that Denton had made her give up. Colt was offering it back in the only form he could figure out. Denton's eyes were on him, flat and measuring. "I don't know who told you that," he said. "Doesn't take outside work." "That's so," Colt said. He let the silence sit there for a moment, not aggressive, just present. Shame. He looked past Denton, not obviously, just a slight shift of his gaze. Clara was standing at the kitchen doorway. She'd heard. Her face was very still. Their eyes met for a second. "Well," Colt said, turning his attention back to Denton, "if you change your mind, the Harlan property's easy enough to find." "Morning to you, Mr. Aldridge." He put his hat on and went back to his horse. He was checking the saddle girth when he heard the screen door open again. Not Denton's boots. Lighter steps. Clara came around the corner of the porch and stopped at a distance that was neither close nor far. She had her hands folded in front of her, and there was a mark at the corner of her jaw that hadn't been there 3 days ago when they'd first spoken. She was looking at him with an expression that was doing its absolute best to be composed and wasn't fully managing it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" he said. Yapped. "For coming to the door." Colt looked at her. Looked at the mark at her jaw. He looked at James, who had edged around the fence and was watching with those complicated eyes. He looked back at Clara. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, and his voice was low enough that it was just for her. "Yeah. I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer." Waited. "Is there anywhere you could go?" he asked. If posure cracked. Just for a second, just around her eyes, like a plate with a hairline fracture that hasn't broken yet but will. "No," she said, and then quieter no. "All right," he said. Put his foot in the stirrup. "The mending work is a real offer. Real pay. I'll put it to him again in a few days in front of some people." He settled into the saddle. Harder to say no with witnesses. Clara looked up at him. Something was happening in her expression that she was trying very hard not to let happen. "Why?" she said. "You don't know me." Colt Briggs looked at her with those quiet, level eyes. "I know what I saw on that porch," he said, "and I know I didn't ride past it." He touched his hat brim and rode toward town. The thing he'd said stayed with Clara for the rest of the day. She went back into the house and put the kitchen back in order and made James a cold lunch with the leftover biscuits and told him about the mockingbird she'd seen in the cottonwood and listened to him talk about the picture book he'd been reading. And smiled at the right moments, and all the while some quiet part of her was turning those words over like a stone in a stream. "I know I didn't ride past it." There was no one in Cedar Ridge who had not ridden past it. Not Mabel Pruitt, who had looked at her wrist and then looked away. Not Dr. Harmon, who had treated her for a cracked rib 14 months ago without asking how she'd gotten it, and she hadn't told him. Not the Reverend at the church, who had spoken to her after Sunday service about the importance of harmony in a household. Not the women who had been her acquaintances in Thomas's time, and who were now cordial in passing, but never invited her to the sewing circles or the church socials. Because having Clara there meant acknowledging the Aldridge situation, and that was uncomfortable for everyone. Not one person in Cedar Ridge had seen what Colt Briggs had seen from a horse on a lane he'd never ridden before. Which didn't mean she trusted him. She'd stopped trusting easily somewhere in the 18 months since Denton arrived, and she suspected that particular muscle didn't come back fast. But she turned his words over and over, not because she trusted them, but because they were the first honest word anyone had said to her in so long that she could feel the shape of them. Denton came home that evening in a better mood. He'd done something that afternoon in town, that he was pleased about, a deal, a negotiation, something that had gone his way, and when things went his way, he could be almost civil. He ate his dinner. He spoke about the cattle market. He went to bed early. Clara sat on the porch after James was asleep. Night was warm and smelled of pine from the mountains, and the stars over Cedar Ridge were extravagant, the way they always were this far from any city, ancient and indifferent and genuinely beautiful. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about what Colt Briggs had asked her. "Is there anywhere you could go, if you decided to?" No, that was the honest answer. Thomas's family was back east and had never warmed to her. Her own family was scattered and either gone or too poor to take on a widow and a child. She had $11 of her own that she'd accumulated over 18 months by saving pennies from the household money hidden in the lining of a carpet bag. She had her sewing skills, which she hadn't been allowed to use for money since Denton decided it was undignified. She had James, who was 8 years old and the most important thing in her world, and the reason she stayed, because until Denton's anger had moved to James, until that she'd told herself she was protecting James by staying, by keeping the peace, by not making things worse, and now Denton's anger had moved to James. That was the thing she had not said out loud to anyone. Not to Mabel, not to Dr. Harmon, not to the ceiling of her bedroom at 2 in the morning. But she knew, with the particular cold certainty of a woman who has been paying attention for 18 months, that the split on James's lip this morning was not going to be the last. That the storm that had always been aimed at her had shifted its direction. That the peace she had been maintaining was not protection anymore. It was just delay. A woman with $11 and a child and no family and no work and no one standing up for her. She looked at the stars. She thought, I know I didn't ride past it. She didn't sleep much that night, but when she did sleep, she didn't dream about Thomas, which was what usually happened. She dreamed about a mockingbird running through 5 songs in under a minute, it cheerful and oblivious, and a voice that said, "Good morning, to you, Mrs. Aldridge." And for just that small sleeping moment, she felt like someone who might be worth a good morning. No, Briggs woke before dawn the way he always did, made coffee on the ranch house's salvage stove, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark while the coffee brewed, and the mountains outside the window went from black to dark blue to the particular bruised purple of an early Colorado morning. He thought about the boy's split lip. He thought about Clara Aldridge's careful hands and her composed face, and the way she'd looked at him for 1 second before she'd gotten herself back under control, like someone who'd been so long in the dark that they'd forgotten light was an option, and a thin beam of it had gotten in through a crack, and they didn't know whether to move toward it or be afraid of it. He thought about what he was going to do about it. He wasn't a man who made decisions fast, as a general rule. He'd learned a long time ago from his father, from bad winters, from a cattle operation that had nearly broken him before it made him, that most things that looked like they needed an immediate response actually needed a considered one. That charging in without a plan was how good intentions became disasters. That patience in the mountains was not passivity. It was strategy. But he also wasn't a man who confused strategy with cowardice. He had a ranch to run. He had a property that needed a significant amount of work before winter, and winter in the Colorado mountains was not the forgiving kind. He had every practical reason in the world to keep his head down, establish himself, learn the land, and stay out of other people's business. He looked at his coffee. He thought about what Walt Greer had said, let people handle their own affairs. He thought about James Aldridge, pressing himself against a fence slat with a split lip, saying, I fell with the conviction of a child who has already learned to protect things that should never need protecting. All right, he said, to nobody in particular. He drank his coffee. He thought about Denton Aldridge and about Cedar Ridge and about the way a town could make a collective agreement to not see something and how that agreement held right up until someone refused to make it. He thought about leverage and what he had and what he might get. He thought about a woman sitting on a porch with her forehead against a post, counting in French. Then he went to work on the fence, but he did not forget. He had not ridden past it. He was not going to start now. 3 days passed before Colt made his move. He spent those 3 days learning Cedar Ridge the way he'd learned every town he'd ever worked in, not by asking for introductions, but by showing up consistently and letting people get used to him. He bought his fence wire at Caldwell's and chatted with Mabel Pruitt about the weather and the cattle market. He had lunch at the Cedar Ridge Diners twice and let the men at the neighboring tables talk around him until they forgot to talk around him. He stopped at the feed store and the livery and the post office, and he was polite and unhurried and listened more than he spoke, and by the third day he had a reasonable map of who ran what in Cedar Ridge and who owed what to whom. What he found was not surprising, but it was useful. Denton Aldridge was not beloved. He was tolerated, which in a small town was a different thing, though people sometimes confused them. He had inherited money from the original Aldridge land holdings, supplemented by a share in a small freighting operation that moved goods between Cedar Ridge and the larger town of Durango 30 miles east. He spent that money visibly, which bought him a certain standing. He paid his accounts on time, which bought him more. He was on the town council, which bought him something close to immunity. But underneath the tolerance was a layer of something less comfortable, a collective awareness, unspoken and carefully maintained, that Denton Aldridge was the kind of man you didn't cross unless you had a very good reason. Freighting operation was interesting. Colt filed that away. On the fourth morning, he rode into town early, went to Caldwell's, before most of the town was moving, waited it for Denton Aldridge. He knew Denton came in most mornings for tobacco. Mabel had mentioned it without knowing she was mentioning it, in the context of talking about her regular customers. Denton arrived at 8:30, same as always, and walked through the door of the general store with the entitled ease of a man who expected things to move out of his way. He pulled up short when he saw Colt at the counter, and the micro-expression that crossed his face, trusting, not for exactly, but a recalibration. "Mr. Aldridge," Colt said pleasantly. "Morning, Briggs," Denton said, moving to the counter. Mabel appeared from the back, took Denton's tobacco order, disappeared again. Colt turned slightly toward Denton, with the body language of a man making casual conversation. "It was asking around," Colt said, "about the mending work. Ranch. Someone suggested your household again." Denton's jaw tightened. "I told you. Clara doesn't take outside work." "I'd pay well," Colt said. "Better than the going rate." "She doesn't need the money." Colt looked at him, just looked steady and direct for just long enough. "Well, he said that's generous of you." His voice was perfectly even. Words were not. Denton's color came slightly. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" "It means a man who provides well for his household doesn't need to worry about his wife taking in extra work," Colt said. He picked up the supplies he'd been waiting for. "No offense meant, Mr. Aldridge. I'll find someone else." He left. He was tying the supplies to his horse outside when he heard the door open behind him. Not Denton's boots. He turned. It was Mabel Pruitt, moving with the specific, purposeful quiet of a woman who has decided to do something she's been not deciding for a while. She stopped next to him and spoke low, looking at the street rather than at him. "Clara Aldridge was the best seamstress in this county," she said. Before Denton stopped her, she paused. "I shouldn't be saying this." "You're saying it anyway," Colt said. "She needs." Mabel stopped again. "She needs something to stand on. Do you understand what I mean? Some way back to herself." She looked at him now, brief and direct. "Whatever it is you're trying to do, Mr. Briggs, I think the intention is right. Be careful. Denton doesn't like being worked around." "I hear you," Colt said. She went back inside. Colt mounted his horse and rode toward Sycamore Lane. He didn't stop at the house. He rode past it slowly, and as he rode past he looked, and what he saw made him pull up the reins for just a moment before he kept going. Clara was in the front yard, hanging laundry on a line, and James was sitting on the porch steps doing something with a bit of rope. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked exactly like a woman and a child, going about a normal morning. Yeah. Except that when James heard the horse, Aiton, he looked up, and when he saw it was Colt, his face did something complicated and hopeful that he didn't quite manage to hide. Touch his hat brim, wrote on. That evening he wrote a letter. He addressed it to Clara Aldridge, and he gave it to Mabel Pruitt the next morning with a dollar coin and a request that she find a way to get it to Clara privately. Mabel took the letter and the coin and looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone weighing something. She'll burn it if she thinks it's dangerous to have, Mabel said. Then she'll burn it, Colt said, but let her read it first. The letter was short. He'd written it 3 times and thrown the first 2 versions into the fire because they were either too much or not enough. The version he gave Mabel said, Mrs. Aldridge, the work offer is genuine. The pay is 50 cents a day, which is fair market, and I'll put it in writing if that helps. James could come with you. There's plenty of room and plenty to occupy a boy his age. The decision is yours entirely. The offer stands as long as you need it to. Old Briggs. He did not say, I know what's happening. He did not say you need to get out of that house. He did not say any of the things that were probably true, but that she didn't need a stranger telling her, because she already knew them and the knowing wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the how. He was trying to offer a how. He went up to the ranch and worked on the fence and waited. 2 days later, Mabel found him at the feed store and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand without stopping or speaking. He waited until he was outside to open it. Clara's handwriting was careful, and even the handwriting of someone who'd been taught by someone who cared about it. Note said, Mr. Briggs, Thursday morning. If you're certain about James. He was certain about James. He was certain about all of it. Thursday was 4 days away. He went home and started making a space. Thursday came with a high blue sky and a wind off the mountains that smelled of pine and something colder hiding underneath it, a reminder that summer in Colorado was always conditional. Clara arrived at the North Ridge Road on foot, which he hadn't expected, with James beside her and a basket that held, he'd learn later, a complete sewing kit and 2 changes of clothes for the boy and 1 for herself. She had not packed for more than a day. She was not ready to think in terms of more than a day. Understood that and did not comment on it. I told Denton I was going to help a neighbor with household mending, she said. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were checking him, measuring. He doesn't know it's you. All right, Colt said. If he finds out, she stopped. If he finds out, Colt said, we'll handle that when it comes. Date is today. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a person who has decided to take step and see where it lands. James looked up at the ranch house with an 8-year-old's barely contained fascination and said, Is that a real barn? That's a real barn, Colt said. Can I see inside? After your mother gets settled, Colt said, you can see the whole property. James looked at Clara. Clara looked at Colt. Something very small and very fragile passed between the 3 of them, something that didn't have a name yet, or if it did, none of them was ready to say it. Come on, then, Agent, Colt said, and led them inside. The ranch house was Clara had expected. She'd expected something stripped and functional, a working man's space with no concessions to comfort. What she found was something that was functional but not stripped, a main room with a solid table and 4 chairs, a fireplace that had been recently cleaned, windows that had been washed on the inside even if the outside still needed work. There were hooks on the wall for coats and hats. There was a braided rug on the floor that was old but clean. Kitchen's through there, Colt said, indicating the door to the left. Bedroom's in the back, and there's a loft where I put a cot for James if he needs a rest. Mending room, he opened the door to a smaller room off the main space. I moved some things out. There's a table and good light from the east window in the morning. Clara stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the table and the good light, and was quiet for a moment. You moved things out, she said. Yesterday, he said. You expected me to come. I hoped, he said. That's different. She turned back to the room and set her basket on the table and opened it and began to take out her sewing kit with the efficient movements of a woman who has a job to do. Her hands were steadier than her face. "What needs doing?" she said. Note he brought her, mending. This was a genuine amount of its shirts, with elbows gone, a coat with a torn lining, canvas work gloves that needed reinforcing, and curtains that had been stored in a trunk and emerged worse for it. He put it all on the table and stepped back. She looked at the pile with something that he recognized after a moment as relief. Not because the work wasn't much it was, but because it was real work. Work she was good at. Work that had nothing to do with Denton Aldridge or Cedar Ridge's opinion of her, or the particular careful smallness her life had shrunk to. 50 cents a day, she said. 50 cents a day, he confirmed. In writing, she said. I'll write it up after lunch, he said. Me. She sat down at the table and picked up the first shirt and threaded a needle from memory, without looking, the way someone does something they've done 10,000 times. Her shoulders dropped about half an inch. It was the most he'd seen her relax. From outside came James's voice. "Mr. Briggs, there's a horse in the barn that's gray. Can I touch it?" "Don't go in the stall," Colt called back. "I'll come to show you how to greet him proper." Clara's mouth curved, not a full smile, but something working its way toward one. "Dove's horses," she said. "Thomas used to." She stopped.
Thomas was your husband?
Colt said. Yes. She kept her eyes on the shirt. "He died 2 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry. He was a good man." She said it simply and directly, the way you say something that is completely true and completely painful, and you've made peace with the pain but not with the loss. "James remembers him. That's something." Colt nodded. He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned long ago that some silences were better left alone, and this one was hers to keep or let go as she chose. "I should go see about your son and my horse," he said. "Mr. Briggs," Clara said. He stopped. She was looking at the shirt in her hands, not at him. Her voice was careful in the way of someone constructing a sentence around something fragile. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "I've been trying to understand it since the first morning, and I can't make it fit into anything I know about people." Colt stood in the doorway for a moment. "Because nobody else was doing it," he said finally. That seemed wrong. He went to find James before she could answer. He didn't need an answer. He'd needed her to ask the question, and she had, and that was enough. By 11 o'clock, she'd repaired 3 shirts with a neatness that made him stop and look twice when she laid them on the table. Not just functional, precise. The stitches were even and nearly invisible, and the reinforced elbows looked like they'd been done at a shop. "He said so. My grandmother taught me," Clara said. She said anything worth doing is worth doing so well that people can't find the seam. Smart woman, Colt said. She was. Clara held up the coat with the torn lining. "This is a good coat. Whoever tore the lining didn't do it on purpose. The stitching was weak to start with. It'll be stronger than new when I'm done. I believe you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're very agreeable for someone who was a complete stranger 10 days ago." "That a problem?" "It's unusual," she said. "So setting up a mending room," he said. The sideways look became something closer to the smile she'd been working toward. "Enough," she said. "Nah." From the barn, James's laugh rang out, a big, uncomplicated, 8-year-old laugh at something a horse had done. Clara's head came up at the sound, and her whole face changed. Not just the almost smile. Something deeper, something that had been braced for a long time, slowly letting go of the brace. "He doesn't laugh like that at home," she said. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was just saying a thing that was true, to a person she was beginning to trust enough to say true things to. He can laugh like that here," Colt said. She looked at him for a moment, this direct look that was taking his measure at something beyond the practical. Then she went back to the coat. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "How long have you had it?" 6 months legally," he said. "I found it 2 years ago. Came through on a cattle drive and rode up into the North Ridge because I wanted to see the view. Found the property, found it was empty, found out the owner was old Grant Harlan who had no heirs and wasn't going to last another winter. I wrote him a letter. We corresponded for a year. When he died, it went through probate and I bought it from the estate." "You planned ahead," she said. I'm a planner, he said. What were you doing before? Before here. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she could feel the difference between evasion and actual consideration. Running cattle in Wyoming, he said. Before that, New Mexico. Nah, I've been moving around since I was about 23. Looking for the right place. And this is it? This is it, he said, with the simple certainty of a man who has made up his mind about something permanent. Clara pressed a seam flat and was quiet for a moment. I used to think Cedar Ridge was the right place, she said. And when Thomas was alive, it felt like home. What does it feel like now? Nah, she didn't answer immediately. The needle went in and came out. In and out, like a place where I'm waiting to leave, she said finally. Words hung in the air between them. She hadn't meant to say that much. He could see it in the slight stillness that came over her after she'd said it, the almost retraction that didn't quite happen. That makes sense, he said. She looked up. You're not going to tell me it gets better? That I should keep my chin up? No, he said. I'm going to ask you what's stopping you. Needle stopped. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. James, she said. Money, no family to go to, no way to support us on my own. She said it flatly, factually, like someone reciting a list they've memorized. I've run the numbers enough times to know what they add up to. Would the numbers need to look like? He said. She stared at him. What to change? What would need to be different? I don't, she stopped. I've never actually had anyone ask me that. I'm asking. Clara set the coat down on the table. She pressed both palms flat on the table surface, in the gesture he was beginning to recognize as her version of steadying herself. She was thinking hard, he could see it happening, the genuine engaged thinking of someone who has been surviving on reflex for so long that actual forward planning felt foreign and strange. If I could work, she said slowly, regularly, enough to save. 6 months of steady income, and I could afford passage somewhere, and a month's rent, and she stopped. But Denton won't allow it. What if Denton's allowance wasn't the relevant factor? Colt said. Nay, she looked at him with an expression that was half hope and half the deep, exhausted skepticism of a woman who has been disappointed enough times to be suspicious of hope. You're talking about defying him, she said. You don't know what that. I know what it looks like, Colt said. I've been watching this town for 10 days. I know who Denton owes and who owes Denton and where the soft spots are. I know he doesn't want trouble with the Harlan property because there's a water rights question on the Eastern Creek that could go badly for his freighting operation if someone with standing decides to push it. He kept his voice level, just laying out the facts. I'm not looking to destroy the man. I'm looking to make it more trouble to come after you than to leave you alone. Clara was very still. You've been thinking about this, she said. Have. He met her eyes, since the first morning. The silence in the small room was different from the silence before. It was the silence of something shifting, of a weight that has been carried so long alone that the possibility of someone else putting their hands on it feels both enormous and terrifying. I don't need rescuing, Clara said. Her voice was careful and clear. Need a ladder, not someone to carry me up it. He nodded. That's what I'm offering. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coat and the needle and went back to work. I'll need Thursdays and Fridays, she said. Those are the days Denton is most likely to be at the freighting office in the afternoon. Done, he said. And I'll need to be back by 4 o'clock. I'll drive you down myself. The money goes directly to me, not through anyone else. I'll put it in your hand. She was quiet for a moment, stitching, steadying herself into the new shape of what this was. All right, she said. All right, he said. He went back out to the barn in James and left her to her work. He did not let the relief show on his face until he was well clear of the house. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks, had the texture of something both provisional and, in some interior way, inevitable. Thursday and Friday mornings, Clara arrived with James. James had quickly established himself as a fixture in the barn. And Colt's ranch hand, a quiet older man named Burl, who had worked cattle operations from Montana to Texas and claimed to have an opinion about everything except other people's business, had taken a measure. liking to the boy and set him to learning simple tasks. Brush a horse properly. How to check a water trough. How to coil a rope so it didn't knot. James absorbed all of it with the intensity of a child who has found something that belongs to him. Clara worked in the small mending room and sometimes in the kitchen when the light was better, and the pile of mending that Colt produced was genuinely inexhaustible. Because he had 20 years of accumulated work on a ranch that had sat empty, and he was not manufacturing it. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who has been given back a language they'd forgotten they spoke. She was faster than he'd expected and more precise, and she hummed sometimes when she didn't know she was doing it. Old hymns, mostly, and one song he didn't recognize that had a minor key that made the hair on his arms stand up slightly. They talked while she worked. Or rather, she worked, and they talked, because she had the seamstress's ability to converse without breaking her concentration, and he had the rancher's habit of talking to whoever was present without requiring them to stop what they were doing. They talked about everything except the thing that was underneath everything. Thomas came in pieces of memory here, a habit there, the way he'd taken his coffee, the argument they'd had once about whether to plant potatoes or not. Colt's Wyoming years came out in the same way. The cattle drive that went wrong in a snowstorm. The spring calving that had saved a bad year. The property in New Mexico that he'd almost bought before the Northridge changed his mind. He learned that she read when she could find books, which wasn't often. He learned that she'd wanted to go to teaching college before she'd married and had filed that particular ambition away without quite giving up on it. He learned that she was funnier than she looked, dry and precise and occasionally devastating, the humor of someone who'd had to find comedy in a situation or drown in it. She learned that he was not a naturally quiet man. He was a man who had gotten quiet by necessity, because the kind of life he'd lived for 20 years didn't offer a lot of people worth talking to, and he'd gotten out of the habit. Put him next to someone worth talking to, and the habit started coming back. She noticed that. He noticed that she noticed. 3 weeks in, on a Friday afternoon while he was driving her, and James back down the ridge road toward town, James fell asleep against Clara's side with the unself-conscious bonelessness of a child who has worn himself out completely. And Clara looked down at him, with an expression stopped Colt's breath for a second, without his permission. He sleeps better after Fridays, she said quietly. Any other night. Good, Colt said. Me last week that the ranch is his favorite place. She paused. Never said that about anywhere. Colt kept his eyes on the road. He's welcome to think of it that way. Clara was quiet for a moment, her hand resting lightly on James's hair. Is dangerous, isn't it, she said, for him. Getting attached. To what? She gestured vaguely at the road, the wagon, the direction they'd come from. This. Hear you, she looked at him sidelong, in case things change. Things are going to change, Colt said. That's the whole point. Not what I mean. I know what you mean. He was quiet for a moment. A hawk crossed the road in front of them, low and fast. I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Aldridge. I bought this property to stay on it. People say a lot of things. I'm aware. He didn't look away from the road. I'm also aware that I've given you no particular reason to believe me yet. I'm not asking for belief. I'm just telling you the fact. He was quiet for a long stretch of road. James breathed evenly against her side. Clara, she said finally. He looked at her. My name is Clara, she said. You've been calling me Mrs. Aldridge for a month. Clara's, that's my name. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in the quiet space between them, something neither of them was ready to examine directly. Clara, he said. She looked away first, back at the road, and the slight color that had come into her face was not from the wind. No, thank you, she said, for all of them. No thanks needed, he said. Colt, she said, testing the shape of it. Clara, he said. They rode the rest of the way down in a silence that felt nothing like the ones before. Then, Denton Aldridge found out. He found out on a Wednesday, which was not a Thursday or a Friday, which meant it was not supposed to be a day that mattered. He found out because he came home early from the freighting office and found James in the kitchen with a length of rope, practicing the coil knot that Burl had taught him, and the rope was not any rope from the Aldridge house, and Denton knew it. Knew it because the rope was good quality, the kind you got from a ranch supply operation, and it had a specific loop tied into one end. That was not how any man in Cedar Ridge tied a rope. "Where'd you get that?" Denton said. James looked up, and the moment his eyes met Denton's, all the confidence went out of him. "I found it," he said. "You found it." Denton walked across the kitchen and took the rope from the boy's hands and turned it over. "Where's your mother?" She went to help someone." "Me. Help who?" "Me." Clara walked in through the back door at that moment, still wearing her work apron, returning earlier than usual, because she'd had a feeling. The kind of feeling she'd learned not to ignore. She took in the scene in 1 second: Denton, with the rope, James's face, the temperature of the room, and she had 1 second to decide whether to lie or not. She decided not. "I've been doing mending work," she said. "The bridge. For 3 weeks. She kept her voice steady and her hands still. "He pays fair wages and I've been saving it. James comes with me." "Nothing improper has occurred." Denton looked at her. Color was rising in his face, the specific slow red that she knew was worse than the fast kind. "It went behind my back," he said. "I went to work," she said. "Which is something I should be allowed to do." The word allowed hit the air between them like a lit match. "Allowed," Denton said. He set the rope down on the table. "You want to talk to me about what you're allowed?" He took 1 step toward her. I told you directly, no outside work." "And I am telling you directly," Ick said. And her voice did something in that moment that surprised even her. It did not shake. "That I am going to continue doing it." Denton stopped. In 18 months, she had never said anything like that. He stared at her. She stood her ground. Behind her, she could feel James frozen in place. "James," she said, without looking away from Denton. "Go to your room, please. Mama now, please." James went. His footsteps went up the stairs fast. Then there was the quiet of him being still up there. Being very still, the way he'd learned to be. Denton took another step toward her. "You think that Cowboy is going to protect you?" he said. "You think one man on a ridge is going to change anything?" "I think," Clara said, "that I have worked that house and earned that money honestly, and I am keeping it. And I think that if you raise your hand to me tonight, I will walk out that door, and I will not be quiet about why." It was a bluff. She knew it was a bluff. She had $11 and now almost 4 more weeks of wages hidden in her carpet bag, and walking out still felt impossible. But she had watched Colt Briggs face Denton Aldridge with steady eyes, and say things directly and simply and not flinch, and some of that had gotten into her bones somewhere along the last 3 weeks, without her realizing it. Denton looked at her for a long time. "You're going to regret this," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but not tonight." He picked up his hat and walked out the front door. She heard his boots on the porch, and then the lane, and then nothing. Clara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the kitchen table and breathed. Nose out through the mouth. Un, deux. Trois. She got to 10, and her hands were still shaking, but she was still standing. Knee. From upstairs, James's voice came down. Very small, Mama." "I'm here," she said. "Everything's fine." She was going to have to tell Colt. That she was going to have to decide what came next. Not because of Denton. Not even because of the money, though the money mattered. But because something had cracked open in that kitchen, something she'd thought was sealed permanently, and now that it was open, she could feel through it, all the things she'd stopped letting herself feel. The possibility of a different kind of life. The specific warmth of a man who asked her what the numbers needed to look like instead of telling her the situation was what it was. The sound of her son laughing in a barn. She stood in the kitchen and shook and breathed in French and let herself feel it. Then she went upstairs to James. "Come here," she said. He came. She held him and felt him hold her back, 8 years old and thin and fierce and so much like Thomas that sometimes it broke her open all over again. "Amma," he said into her shoulder, "are we going to be okay?" She thought about a coil of rope and a gray horse and a man who had made a room with a good east window and hadn't once told her what to do with it. "Yes," she said. She meant it. She told him the next morning. She didn't send a note through Mabel this time. She walked up the North Ridge Road herself, alone, leaving James with strict instructions to stay inside and tell Denton she'd gone to the dry goods store if he asked. It was early enough that the town was still finding itself, shops just opening, just starting to move through the streets, and nobody paid her particular attention. She was just the widow Aldridge going somewhere on foot, which was not unusual enough to remark on. The walk up the ridge took 40 minutes. She arrived with her hair coming loose from its bun and her boots dusty and her breathing harder than she wanted it to be, and Colt was in the yard splitting wood when she came around the bend in the road. And set down the axe and was walking toward her before she'd fully stopped. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, he could read it in her face. "He knows," she said. "About the work. About coming here." She told him the rest quickly and without embellishment, Denton finding the rope, the confrontation in the kitchen, what she'd said. When she got to the part where she'd told Denton she would walk out and not be quiet about why, Colt's expression did something complex that she couldn't fully read. "You said that. How'd he take it?" "Left." She pressed her lips together. "He'll be thinking. Deciding what to do next. Denton doesn't act immediately when he's surprised. Waits until he's figured out the angle." Colt nodded slowly. He was looking past her at the road, thinking. Then he looked back at her. "How much have you saved?" $11 of my own. "Almost 4 weeks of what you've paid me. A bit over $7. 18 total, he said. 18 total, she agreed. "That's not enough to get you where you'd need to go and set yourself up on the other end." He said it plainly, without apology. "Not with James. It isn't." They looked at each other. "I need more time," she said. "And Denton's not going to give it to me now." Was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind where she could see him working something through from multiple angles. Then he said, "All right, I want to show you something." He led her inside to the kitchen table and pulled out a folded piece of paper from the shelf above the fireplace. He spread it on the table. Letter. She saw, from something called the Colorado Territorial Land Office, dated 2 months prior. "Grant Harlan's property, my property, now has a water rights claim on the North Creek that's been in dispute for 12 years, Colt said. The previous claim on the other side of that dispute is Denton Aldridge's freighting operation." Lara looked at the letter, then at him. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. It's the kind of thing that gets buried in documents." He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "This letter says the Territorial Land Office is reviewing the claim. They need a formal response from the current property holder me within 60 days. If I push it and the original filing holds, Denton loses water access to the eastern route his freight wagons use. It would cost him somewhere between a lot and everything, depending on how he's leveraged." Clara was very still. "You've had this for 2 months."
Yes.
"And you haven't filed the response?" "No." She looked up at him. "Why not?" Colt met her eyes directly. "Because I wanted to know if I was going to need it." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the barn. Clara looked at the letter again, at the careful legal language that meant, translated into plain speech, that Colt Briggs had been holding a loaded weapon for 2 months, in case he needed it to protect her. "That's a significant thing to have held back," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why would you?" She stopped. Started again. "That's leverage you could have used for yourself, for the ranch." "I don't need it for the ranch," he said. "The ranch is fine." Colt. Her voice had something in it that she hadn't meant to put there. "You did this on purpose." He didn't look away. "I did." Pressed both hands flat on the table and took a breath. Her chest felt tight with something she wasn't ready to name yet. "If you use this," she said, "Denton will know it came from you. He'll know you've been planning it." "Yes," Colt said. "That's why I haven't filed it yet. The moment I do, this stops being quiet." He paused. "But Clara, it's already not quiet. He knows you've been coming here. He's going to come after it directly. And he does. I need something bigger than good intentions to stand between you and whatever he decides to do." She looked at the letter for a long moment. 18 months of careful, contained survival up against a door that was starting to open, whether she wanted it to or not. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need to know if you're ready for this to move fast," he said. "Because once I file that response, things are going to move fast." She thought about James asleep against her side in the wagon. She thought about her hands shaking in the kitchen. She thought about standing her ground and meaning it, and the way it had felt terrifying and necessary, like the first breath after a long time underwater. She said. Colt held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded once, folded the letter, and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll ride to Durango tomorrow," he said. "Land office opens at 9. She stood from the table. "I should get back before Denton." Clara. He said her name the way he'd been saying it since she gave it to him, careful and direct, like it meant something. "When you get home, don't tell him anything. Don't argue. Don't give him a reason." She looked at him. "I know how to manage him." "You do," he said. "I know you've been doing it for 18 months, and I'm not telling you don't. I'm saying just a few more days. Give me a few days to get this moving." She held his gaze. Something passed between them that was bigger than the conversation, bigger than the letter, bigger than Cedar Ridge and Denton Aldridge and everything she'd been carrying. It was the specific feeling of trusting someone with something you'd kept entirely to yourself for a very long time. "A few days," she said. She walked back down the ridge road alone, and she counted in French the whole way, and she didn't shake once. And Colt rode to Durango the next morning and filed the response with the Territorial Land Office. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who processed land filings, with the enthusiasm of someone counting ceiling tiles, stamped the document and gave Colt his copy without interest. Colt rode back to Cedar Ridge with the copy in his saddlebag and the particular settled feeling of a man who has committed to a course of action. There was no going back from it. He'd known that before he filed, and he knew it more clearly now, and it did not worry him. He'd made irreversible decisions before. The trick was to make sure you'd thought them through properly before you made them. He had. He was back in Cedar Ridge by early afternoon, and he went directly to the telegraph office. He sent 2 telegrams. The first was to a man named Harrington in Denver, a lawyer he'd used in the Wyoming land dispute, a man with a reputation for being difficult to intimidate and comfortable with frontier law. The message was brief. "Need your eyes on a water rights matter, and potentially more. Cedar Ridge, Colorado. Respond with availability." The second telegram was to a former Cattle Association contact in Santa Fe who had connections with the Colorado Territorial Marshal's office. That one was shorter still, looking into a man named Denton Aldridge, Cedar Ridge. In operation. Interested in anything in the record. He sent the telegrams and rode home. 2 days later, both answers came back. Harrington could be in Cedar Ridge within the week. The Santa Fe contact's reply was more interesting. Aldridge name flagged in territorial records. Labor dispute 1,879. Settled out of court. A fraud complaint. Durango. 1,880. Insufficient evidence to prosecute. Recommend caution. Colt read both replies twice. He folded them and put them in the same place he'd kept the water rights letter. Then he went and found Burl in the barn and said, "I'm gonna need you to be around the house more for the next few weeks." Burl looked up from the harness he was mending. He was 61 years old, and had seen enough of the world to know when a statement like that was about more than just ranch logistics. "Aked woman. Her trouble," Colt said. "Not mine," nodded slowly. "The widow from town." "And her boy." Burl looked at him for a long moment with the measuring gaze of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to read them accurately. "You sure about this, boss?" "Sure enough," Colt said. "Because getting between a man and his household in this territory." "She's not his household," Colt said. The words came out with more edge than he intended. He steadied his voice. "She's a woman who has nowhere to go and a child to protect, and a man making that combination worse every day." "And no, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure enough." Burl was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll be around the house." Colt went back inside. He sat at the kitchen table in the early evening, the telegrams in front of him, and thought about Clara. Not about the plan was clear enough. About Clara herself. About the way she said his name now. Colt like she'd always known it. Me. About the dry, precise humor that surfaced when she was comfortable enough. Yeah. About the look on her face when James laughed in the barn. That look of someone watching something precious be safe for a moment. He thought about Thomas Aldridge, whom he'd never met, and about what it meant to love someone steady and lose them, and about what a person did with the part of themselves that was still capable of that kind of loving once the person they'd given it to was gone. Nay, he thought about the empty dining table and the untouched spaces in the ranch house that had been empty for years, and how they'd been filling up, slowly, on Thursday and Friday mornings. How the house sounded different when James was in the barn. He was not a man given to self-deception. He knew what he was doing and why. He folded the telegrams away and went to make dinner. On Thursday morning, Clara didn't come. He waited until 9 o'clock, which was later than she'd ever arrived, and then he saddled his horse. He told himself he was going to town for supplies. He did not believe himself. He found her at the dry goods store actually buying flour, which told him she'd had a reason to come to town that gave her cover. She saw him come through the door, and the relief on her face was immediate and then carefully controlled. "Mr. Briggs," she said, with the public formality they'd established for Cedar Ridge's benefit. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "Morning. I was hoping to run into someone from your household. I've got more mending than I expected this week." Cover story. She followed it without hesitation. "I'm sure we can work something out," she said. Then, quiet, moving slightly away from Mabel, Denton came home, drunk Tuesday night. Nothing happened, but he was looking for something to start with, and I didn't want to give him the walk up the ridge. "Smart," Colt said. "He's been asking around town about you," she said. "About the Harlan property. I heard it from Mabel." Her eyes were steady on him. "He's connecting the pieces." "Good," Colt said. She blinked. "Good? When he's connected all the pieces, he'll come to me directly," Colt said. "That's what I need him to do. I need him in front of me where I can see him, not working around corners." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You want a confrontation?" "I want it to happen on my terms instead of his." She considered this. "You filed the response," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Day morning," he said. "Harrington, my lawyer, will be here by Saturday." Something moved through her expression. Fear and relief at exactly the same time, the way those two things always seemed to travel together when the stakes were real. "It's moving fast," she said. "You said to file it." "I know I did." She pressed her lips together. "I know." She looked at the flower in her hands, then back at him. "James asks about the gray horse every day." Colt felt something in his chest that he was not going to examine right now in the middle of Caldwell's general store. "Tell him the gray horse asks about him too," he said. Clara's mouth curved just barely. "You're making that up." "Horse has been moping," he said. "Make of it what you will." She almost laughed. Not quite, because this was Cedar Ridge and Mabel was 12 feet away, and there were rules, but the almost law was enough. She straightened up and composed her face and said, in the public voice, "I'll see what I can do about Friday, if Denton's schedule permits." "Much obliged," Colt said. He touched his hat brim and left. He was at his horse outside when Sheriff Walt Greer stepped up beside him. "Mr. Briggs," Greer said. "Sheriff, I heard you filed a water rights response with the Territorial Office," Greer said. He kept his voice mild, but he was watching Colt carefully. "I did," Colt said. "It's my property. The water rights are in dispute." "I'm responding to a legal notice. That's what a man does." Greer was quiet for a moment. "Denton Aldridge is going to see that as a provocation." "Denton Aldridge is welcome to respond through the appropriate legal channels," Colt said. "You know that's not how Denton operates." "I know," Colt said. He looked at Greer directly. "Which is why I'd appreciate the law knowing there's a situation developing, so that when Denton decides to operate the way he operates, there are witnesses who understand the context." Greer stared at him. He looked like a man who has just realized that the quiet new neighbor he'd decided not to worry about was in fact several steps ahead of him. You've been planning this, he said. I've been responding to circumstances, Colt said. Hey, Sheriff. He rode home. Denton Aldridge came to the ranch on a Friday. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men from his freighting operation, big men, the kind that were employed for reasons beyond lifting crates. He rode up the North Ridge Road in the mid-morning, and Colt saw them coming from 200 yards out and had time to walk from the fence line he'd been repairing to the front of the house. He was standing in the yard, tools in hand, when Denton pulled up. Burl was visible at the barn door, not conspicuously positioned. Just present, Denton got down from his horse with the elaborate casualness of a man performing confidence. "Meeg's edge," Colt said. "Long ride up the ridge. Get down and water your horses if you need." Denton didn't take the hospitality. He stood with his 2 men slightly behind him and looked at Colt with the flat measuring look that Colt had seen on him before. "Idled a water rights response," he said. "I did," Colt said. "That creek supplies my eastern freight route. That's a matter for the Territorial Land Office to sort out," Colt said. "Which is why I filed through them. You bought that property 2 months ago," Denton said. "The water dispute has been dormant for 3 years. The day after my sister-in-law told me she'd been coming up here for work." Colt looked at him steadily. "That's an interesting theory of causation," he said. "You stay away from Clara," Denton said. The civility was entirely gone now. "She's my ward, my responsibility, and you're sticking your nose into private family business." "Clara Aldridge is a grown woman who does skilled work for fair wages," Colt said. "That's not private family business. That's commerce." Denton took a step forward. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in." "I know exactly what I'm involving myself in," Colt said. "Nay." His voice was still even. "And I'd remind you that you're standing on my property, and you're welcome to stay as long as you're civil, and you can leave the way you came when you're ready." One of the men behind Denton shifted his weight forward, or straightened in the barn doorway. Denton looked at Burl, then back at Colt. Calculation was happening behind his eyes, angles, what he could and couldn't do, and what it would cost him. "You think a water rights filing scares me," Denton said. "I think a fraud complaint from 1,880 in Durango might concern you more," Colt said pleasantly. Silence was absolute. Denton's face went through several things in rapid succession. Shock first, genuine and unguarded, and then a cold fury that was much more dangerous than the bluster had been, and then a mask coming down over all of it, a mask of a man who knows he's been outmaneuvered and is deciding how to respond. "Where'd you hear that?" he said. His voice was very quiet now. "I write a lot of letters," Colt said, "and I read the ones I get back." Denton looked at him for a long, flat moment. "You have no idea," he said, "what this is going to cost you." "Mr. Aldridge, agent," Colt said. His voice dropped to something that was not threatening in any theatrical way, but was completely, utterly serious. "I have been in this territory for 6 months, and in this state of affairs for considerably less. I've filed through proper legal channels. I've employed a woman who has every right to work, and I've done nothing that any court in Colorado would object to. If you've got a legal dispute, take it to the lawyers. If you've got something else in mind, I'd encourage you to think it through more carefully than you've thought through a few other things." Denton stared at him. "Durango was a misunderstanding," he said finally. "Then you'll be able to explain it clearly," Colt said. Another long silence. Then Denton turned and went back to his horse. His 2 men followed. He mounted up and looked down at Colt from the saddle with an expression that was pure, cold promise. "Isn't finished," Denton said. "I didn't imagine it was," Colt said. He watched them ride down the ridge road until they were gone. Then he stood in the yard for a moment in the summer heat and let out a slow breath. Came out of the barn. "That went well," Burl said dryly. "About as well as I expected," Colt said. "He'll go after Clara next." "Night or tomorrow." Burl was quiet. "And I need to talk to Clara," Colt said. He was already moving toward his horse. "Right now." He found her at Caldwell's, which was not a coincidence, he'd noticed. She tended to be in town on Friday afternoons when she could manufacture a reason. partly to stay out of the house, and partly because Mabel was there, and Mabel was the closest thing she had to an ally within Cedar Ridge itself. She saw his face when he came through the door, and she set down the spool of thread she'd been looking at. "He came to the ranch," she said. "This morning," Colt said. He steered her toward the far end of the counter, where Mabel was conspicuously not listening from 6 feet away. He told her quickly Denton's visit, the 2 men, what had been said. When he got to the Durango fraud complaint, Clara's eyes widened. "I didn't know about that," she said. "The point is he did," Colt said. "And now he knows I know. He's going to come home tonight and he's going to be—" He chose the word carefully. Unsettled. Clara looked at him. Her face had gone to that particular stillness she used when she was deciding something fast. "James is at home," she said. "I know." He kept his voice steady. "Is there anyone you could send him to tonight? Anyone in town?" She thought for only a second. "Mabel," she said. "Mabel." From 6 feet away, he said, without turning around, "I have a spare room and a cat that James likes." Clara looked at Mabel's back, with an expression that was grated embarrassment and relief all at once. "You were listening," she said. "I'm always listening," Mabel said. "I just generally don't say so." She turned around. She looked at Clara directly, not with the careful avoidance of the past 18 months, but with the look of a woman who has made a decision. "Send him here at 4. I'll feed him dinner." Clara pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to cry in Caldwell's general store. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Mabel said. "I should have done more a long time ago." She looked at Colt. "Both of us should have." Colt didn't disagree with her. "Get James to Mabel's by 4, he told Clara. "Then go home. Behave exactly as you normally would. Don't tell Denton anything." "Then what?" Clara said. "Then my lawyer gets to Cedar Ridge tomorrow morning," he said. "And we stop waiting for Denton to decide what happens next." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something had changed in her face since the day in the kitchen when Denton had found the rope. Something that had been braced for a long time had not gone back to being braced. She was frightened, he could see that clearly, but underneath the fear was something harder and more durable, a woman who had decided to stop being managed by her own fear. "All right," she said. He nodded. He was about to turn when she said his name. "Colt." She said it quietly. "Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that what you've done here," she stopped. "Again. You didn't have to do any of this, Clara," he said. "Let me finish." She looked at him steadily. "You built a room with a good east window. You gave my son a gray horse to visit. You filed legal papers and wrote letters and held back leverage you didn't have to hold back. And you did all of it without," her voice steadied, "without ever making me feel like I owed you something for it. You understand how rare that is." He did not look away from her. "Yes," he said quietly. Her chin came up. "Good. I wanted to say it." Mabel was deeply interested in her thread inventory. Colt put on his hat. "I'll be in town early tomorrow," he said. "End word to the ranch if you need anything before then." He walked out into the summer afternoon, and the sun was high and hot, and somewhere in Cedar Ridge a mockingbird was running through its repertoire, and he did not let himself think about anything except what needed to happen next. What happened that night was worse than he'd prepared for, and also not. It was worse because Denton came home with the specific cold fury of a man who has been thinking all day, and the thinking had landed somewhere dangerous. He did not shout. He did not hit. That would have been, in some terrible way, almost easier than known quantity, the sequence Clara had learned to survive. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table, while Clara made dinner and talked in a low, steady voice about what was going to happen. He talked about the will, the document that had made Clara a dependent of the Aldridge estate. He talked about the clause in it, a clause she had never been shown the full text of that, gave him the authority to place James in the care of the estate rather than Clara if he judged Clara to be acting against the interests of the household. "You've been going to that man's property," Denton said. "Unchaperoned, for weeks, taking my ward child with you." He turned his glass in his hands. "That's not the behavior of a respectable widow." Clara stood at the stove and kept her face still. "I was working," she said. "That's not how the document reads," Denton said. She turned to look at him. You would threaten James. I'm explaining the situation, Denton said. Clearly. Clara looked at him. This man who had sat at Thomas's funeral, with a face she'd thought was grief and had been calculation. This man who had arrived with a lawyer and a document, and a tone that said it was already decided. This man who had spent 18 months turning the word home into something she was trapped in rather than held by. Document, she said. I want to see the full text. Denton smiled. It was not a pleasant thing. It's at my attorney's office. Then I'll go to his office tomorrow, she said. Denton set down his glass. You'll do what I tell you, he said, which is stop seeing that man and stop taking his money and stop giving this town reasons to talk about you. That's all you have to do, Clara, that's all. His voice was almost gentle. I'm trying to protect you. Clara looked at him for a long moment. All of the things she'd been holding, the fear, the careful management, the survival instincts honed over 18 months of exactly this, all of it was still there. She was not a woman who had been magically transformed by weeks of Thursday mornings and a lawyer riding from Durango. She was still in the kitchen. He was still at the table. And the power in the room was still arranged the way it had always been. But she had stopped, sleeping through the numbers. Denton, she said. I need you to hear me say this clearly, because I'm to say it once. If there is a clause in that will that relates to James, I am going to find out what it says. I am going to have someone who knows the law look at it. If it says what you say it says, I am going to respond to it through every legal avenue available to me. She paused. And if you do anything to James in the meantime, there will be no version of the future in which this stays quiet. Denton stared at her. She held his gaze and did not count in French. He got up from the table. He went upstairs. He did not touch her. Clara stood in the kitchen until she heard his bedroom door close. Then she walked to the parlor where she'd put her carpetbag, and she opened the lining, and she counted the money. $18.40. She thought about what Colt had said. When he's connected all the pieces, he'll come to me directly. That's what I need him to do. She thought he came to me instead. She thought about a clause in a will she'd never seen the full text of, and a lawyer arriving in Cedar Ridge tomorrow morning, and a man who had held back leverage for 2 months just in case. She thought, I need to tell Colt about the will tonight. She sat down and wrote a note in the quick, careful handwriting her grandmother had taught her, and she put on her coat, and she walked 3 houses down to where the boy who ran errands for the general store lived. And she knocked on his door and gave him a dime and said, I need this to get to the Harlan property on the North Ridge tonight. Can you do that? He could. She walked home in the summer dark and counted stars instead of counting in French, because she was done counting in French, and she went to sleep with her $18.40 in her hand. Will. That was the thing she should have seen sooner. That was the thing Denton had been holding the whole time, the same way Colt had held the water rights letter, except Colt had used his leverage to build a ladder, and Denton had used his to build a cage. Tomorrow, she decided, the cage was going to open. One way or another. She closed her fist around the money, and she did not shake, and she did not count, and, when she finally slept, dreamed of nothing at all, which was the most restful thing she'd felt in 18 months. Colt got Clara's note at 9:30 that night. The errand boy knocked on the ranch house door, while Colt was still at the kitchen table going over Harrington's preliminary notes on the water rights case, and when he unfolded the paper and read it, he sat very still for a moment. Then he read it again. The note said, There is a clause in Thomas's will I have never seen the full text of. Denton says it gives him authority over James if he judges me unfit. He used it tonight as a warning. I believe he will use it as a weapon tomorrow. I thought you should know, before your lawyer arrives. Am all right, James is at Mabel C. He set the note down. He thought about a woman sitting alone in that house with 18 months of careful survival and a man at the top of the stairs who had just shown her the sharpest thing in his arsenal. He thought about what it cost her to write that note, the trust it represented, the deliberate choice to not handle it alone the way she'd been handling everything alone. He picked up the note and went to find Harrington. Harrington was staying at Cedar Ridge's single boarding house, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the town, which had been quietly vibrating with speculation since the lawyer's arrival that afternoon. Edward Harrington was 53 years old, lean and deliberate, with the kind of face that gave nothing away, and the kind of mind that gave away even less. He'd handled Colt's Wyoming land dispute 4 years ago and won it cleanly, and Colt trusted him the way you trusted a tool that had proven itself under pressure. Knocked on Harrington's door at 9:45. Harrington opened it in his shirt sleeves, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "We have a development," Colt said. He gave Harrington the note. Harrington read it, set it on the desk, and picked up his pen. "Tell me everything you know about the Aldridge estate and the will," he said. Told him everything he knew, which was not as much as he'd have liked. Thomas Aldridge had died in the winter of 1881, intested as far as anyone publicly knew, and Denton had arrived with a will and a lawyer named Fitch who operated out of Durango. The will had made Clara a dependent of the estate rather than an inheritor of it, which was unusual but not unheard of in situations where a man died with debts or complex property arrangements. The clause about the child, Harrington said, "Guardianship provisions in frontier wills are frequently poorly drawn." Depending on how the language actually reads, Denton may have considerably less authority than he's representing. He looked at Colt. "But we need the document. Fitch has it," Colt said. "Durango. I know 3 men in Durango," Harrington said. "I'll send a telegraph first thing tomorrow. If Fitch is the man I'm thinking of, he's the kind of attorney who is very careful about his professional reputation." He paused. "Meaning if the document was drawn improperly, he'll be motivated to cooperate with a review, rather than be associated with what comes out when it's exposed." "You think there's something wrong with it," Colt said. "I think a man who used a fraud complaint in 1880 to establish a pattern of behavior does not suddenly become straightforward in 1881, Harrington said. "I think the will that arrived conveniently shortly after Thomas Aldridge's death deserves a careful reading." He picked up his pen again. "Anne, how soon can you get Mrs. Aldridge here tomorrow morning?" "As early as she can manage without raising suspicion," Colt said. "Get her here," Harrington said. "I need to hear the full account from her directly." Colt stood to leave, then stopped. "Harrington, if the will is fraudulent, then Mrs. Aldridge is not a dependent of the Aldridge estate," Harrington said simply. "Then she never was." The weight of that sentence sat in the room between them. "Get some sleep," Harrington said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Colt rode home in the summer dark and did not sleep. Clara arrived at the ranch at 7 in the morning. She'd left the house before Denton was fully awake, telling the woman who came to help with the household on Saturday mornings that she had an errand in town. She'd walked fast and arrived with her jaw set and her eyes clear, and she had the look of someone who has been awake for most of the night making decisions and has arrived at the other side of them resolved. Erkinen was already at the table with his papers. 8 he stood when she came in, which she clearly hadn't expected the courtesy of a man from a world where such things were still observed. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "Edward Harrington. I'm representing Mr. Riggs's interests in the water rights matter, and I'm hoping to be useful to you in some additional regards as well." "Please sat." Colt sat across from her. Harrington opened his notebook. "Tell me about the will," Harrington said. "Everything you remember about the day Denton arrived. Every word of the document you were shown, every name on it." Clara told him. She was precise and detailed, and her memory was, Colt noted, exceptional. The specific language Denton's lawyer Fitch had used, the date at the top of the document, names of the 2 witnesses, the particular wording of the dependent clause that had made her stomach drop when she'd first read it, and that she'd told herself she was misunderstanding. Harrington wrote continuously. Then, when she was done, he read back what he'd written, asked 3 clarifying questions, then sat back. "Witness names," he said. "The 2 men who witnessed the will's signing." "Know who they are?" Clara shook her head. "The names were George Alcott and R. Lem Patterson. I didn't recognize them. Harrington looked at Colt. And something passed between the two men that Clara couldn't read. Alcott and Patterson, Harrington said. You know them? Colt said. George Alcott, Harrington said carefully, is an associate of a man I prosecuted in a land fraud case in New Mexico in 1878. He has been connected to several questionable estate arrangements in this territory since then. He paused. If his name is on that will, the will needs to be examined very carefully by the territorial court. Clara had gone very still. Are you saying the will is fraudulent? I'm saying it needs to be examined, Harrington said. What I'm telling you is that I have grounds to request a formal review, and the presence of that name gives me considerable leverage to get one. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. It was the gesture she made when the world was shifting faster than she could track. If the will is invalid, she said slowly, then the dependent clause doesn't exist, Harrington said, and your authority over your son has never been in question. Silence in the kitchen was enormous. Colt watched Clara's face move through things shocked now, then something fierce and bright that she pushed down immediately, then a careful, measured consideration that was characteristic of a woman who had learned not to trust good news too fast. How long does a review take, she said. To initiate it, I can file the petition in Durango on Monday. Harrington picked up his pen again. A formal review of a contested will in this territory typically takes between 2 and 4 months. However, if Fitch has any professional sense at all, the moment he knows we're looking at that document with Alcott's name on it, he left the sentence unfinished in a way that finished itself. He'll cooperate, Clara said. Attorneys protect their licenses, Harrington said. It's a powerful motivator. Clara looked at Colt. There was something in her eyes that he'd never seen there before, not hope exactly, because hope implied uncertainty, and this was more solid than that. It was the look of someone who has just seen a door that they'd believed was permanently locked standing slightly open. You found all of this, she said. Harrington found it, Colt said. Sent for Harrington, she said. Weeks ago. He held her gaze and didn't deflect it. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know whether to be furious that you planned this far ahead, or she stopped. Or, he said. She shook her head, not answering, but her expression answered for her, and the answer was not fury. Harrington, with the diplomatic obliviousness of a man who had spent 30 years navigating other people's complicated moments, began organizing his papers. The telegraph to Durango went out at 8 o'clock. By noon, Fitch had responded. Harrington came to find Colt at the feed store, where Colt had been methodically doing exactly what he'd said he was doing, buying supplies. Being like a man who had nothing on his mind beyond ranch logistics, and handed him a folded telegram without expression. Read it. Then he handed it back. That fast, he said. I told you, Harrington said. Professional reputation. The telegram from Fitch said, in the careful language of a man who was cooperating, while pretending he was merely clarifying, prepared to discuss certain irregularities in the Aldridge estate document upon formal request. Available Monday, Durango. Fitch, irregularities. There it. He already knew, Colt said. He always knew, Harrington said. And hoping no one would look at it closely enough, he folded the telegram away. We'll go to Durango Monday morning. You, me, and Mrs. Aldridge, Colt said. Will have to be managed, Harrington said. That's the remaining piece. Colt looked across the street at the Aldridge house, visible from where they stood, ordinary and contained. He's going to move before Monday, he said. He knows something is happening. He's not going to sit and wait. What will he do? Old thought about Denton the Colt calculation, the patience that was actually just a slower version of force. He'll try to get Clara to back down, he said, tonight or tomorrow. And if she doesn't back down, he'll try to use James. Can he physically remove the boy? Not legally, Harrington said. Even under the existing will as written, a guardianship transfer requires a court order. He can't just take him. He paused, but a man like that, cornered, doesn't always operate on what's legal. Nodded once. I'm going to need Clara out of that house, he said. Night. By tonight, Colt said. He went to find Clara. He found her at home. He didn't go to the front door. He went to the side gate, the one that opened into the kitchen yard, the one she could see from the kitchen window. Lay waited. 30 seconds later, the back door opened and she came out with a dish towel in her hands, looking for all the world like a woman checking her garden, except that her eyes went straight to him. Need to talk, he said quietly. Denton's inside, she said just as quietly. No. Walk to the fence, like you're checking something. She walked to the garden fence and bent over it, examining a post, and he stood on the other side. To anyone watching from the house, it was a neighbor stopping to exchange words over a fence. Cedar Ridge people did it all the time, Fitch responded, he said. He confirmed irregularities. We go to Durango Monday and the will gets examined. He watched her face. But Denton is going to move before then, tonight or tomorrow. Clara's hands were steady on the fence post. How sure are you? He said, I need you and James out of that house before this evening. The ranch, he said. A pause. If I leave, she said, Denton will say I abandoned the household. He'll use it. Harrington says he can't make a guardianship move without a court order regardless, Colt said. And the moment we're in front of a judge with Fitch's admission, the will is being reviewed. Leverage on James disappears. You make it sound simple, she said. It's not simple, he said. It's just the best option. She was quiet for a moment, hands on the fence, the posture of a woman running numbers fast. James is at Mabel's still, she said. I was going to get him this afternoon. Get him and come straight up the ridge, he said. I'll be watching the road. My things, she said. In the carpetbag, bring what you can carry in one trip, he said. We can figure out the rest later. Clara looked at him directly. Colt, if I walk out of that house today, that's it. There's no walking it back. I know, he said. You understand what you're offering, she said. It's not just work. It's not just Thursday mornings. She stopped. He met her eyes and kept his voice steady and sure. I know what I'm offering, he said. Something in her face shifted, something that had been held behind glass for a very long time, carefully preserved and carefully protected, allowed itself a fraction of an inch of movement towards something it had stopped believing it could have. All right, she said. She went back inside. He went back to his horse. She walked out of the Aldridge house at 2 in the afternoon. She walked out the front door, which she did on purpose, because leaving through the back felt like sneaking, and she was done sneaking. She had the carpetbag in one hand and her sewing kit in the other, and her head up, and she walked down Sycamore Lane toward Mabel's house with the straight-back, deliberate stride of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it. Denton saw her from the parlor window. She heard the front door open behind her. Clara, his voice sharp and controlled. She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him standing on the porch of the house that had been Thomas's house and was supposed to have been hers. I'm leaving, she said. You're not taking that boy, Denton said. James is my son, she said. He goes where I go. Will. There are irregularities in that will, Clara said, and the word landed exactly the way she intended it to, like a key in a lock that had been rusted ice shut for 18 months turning. Denton's face changed. Mr. Harrington will be in Durango Monday morning, she said. Mr. Fitch has already indicated he's prepared to discuss those irregularities. I suggest you speak to an attorney of your own before then. She turned around and walked. You'll regret this, Denton said from the porch. You don't have anywhere to go. You don't have anything. She walked. She heard him call after her once more, something she didn't let herself process, and then she was at the end of Sycamore Lane, and she was not shaking. She was not counting in French. She was just walking, and foot in front of the other, in the direction of Mabel Pruitt's house and her son and the North Ridge Road. Mabel met her at the door. She took one look at Clara, the carpetbag, the sewing kit, the way she was holding her shoulders, and opened the door wide. James is in the back with the cat, Mabel said. I'll get him. Mabel, Clara said. Mabel stopped. I'm sorry I said I was fine when I wasn't, Clara said. For a long time, Mabel looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a woman who had been carrying her own guilt about this for longer than was comfortable. Eh. I'm sorry I let you say it, she said. They looked at each other, and something was acknowledged and released between them, the quiet, complicated thing that happens when two people admit simultaneously that they could have been braver sooner. Then Mabel went to get James. He came around the corner and saw Clara and the carpet bag, and his face went through a rapid sequence of things. Mama, are we going somewhere? We're going to the ranch, Clara said. A while, James stared at her. To Mr. Briggs's ranch. To stay for now, she said. Come on. James looked at the cat which was winding around his ankles. He looked at his mother. He made the calculation with the blunt efficiency of an 8-year-old who has spent too long reading adult situations. Is Uncle Denton angry? Uncle Denton is, Clara said carefully, dealing with some things. We're going somewhere safe while he deals with them. James nodded. He bent down and gave the cat a swift, solemn farewell pat, then straightened up and took Clara's free hand. Okay, he said, with the simplicity of a child who has needed this to happen for a long time and is relieved it finally has. They walked up the North Ridge Road. Colt was watching from the top of the road, as he'd said he would be. He saw them coming, the woman with the carpet bag and the sewing kit, and the boy with his hand in hers, and he felt something in his chest that he was not going to examine while he was still on horseback. Ode down to meet them. James looked up at him with those complicated, hopeful eyes. Mr. Briggs, he said, says we're staying. For now, Colt said, looking at Clara. She agreed. Can I see the gray horse? James said. Has been waiting, Colt said. He dismounted and led his horse, and James walked beside him, talking about the cat and about what he'd been learning about rope knots. And Clara walked on the other side of the horse, in her afternoon, with the carpet bag in her hand, slowly asleep, incrementally dropping from where she'd been holding them for 18 months. And when they reached the ranch yard, James ran ahead toward the barn, and it was just the two of them for a moment, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Thank you, Clara said. Don't, he said. I'm going to, she said. I walked out of that house today, and I want you to know that I did it because I decided to, not because I was pushed, but I want to be clear about that. He looked at her. It's clear, he said. It was never in question. She held his gaze. I also want to be clear, she said, that I know you've done a great deal for us. And I intend to be worth it. You already are, he said. The words amply, without calculation, and hung in the summer air, and Clara looked at him with those light-holding brown eyes, and did not look away. Barn, James's voice rang out. He remembers me, Mr. Briggs. The gray horse remembers me. The moment broke gently, the way moments do when they've said what they needed to say. Out himself a small smile. I told you, he said. Moping, Clara laughed, an actual, full, unguarded laugh, the first one he'd heard from her, and it was the most natural sound he'd encountered in Colorado. She pressed her hand to her mouth immediately after, surprised by it herself. Hey, she said. Don't apologize for that, he said. She looked at him, flushed slightly, and went toward the barn to find her son. Old stood in the yard and let himself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what the day had been. Then Burl appeared at the barn door with the expression of a man who has watched the entire sequence and has opinions he is too professional to share, and, Colt said, then, not a word, Burl, and Burl said, and wasn't going to say a thing, which they both understood, to mean he was going to say everything, never, eventually, probably at the least convenient moment. Colt went to start dinner. That evening they sat at the kitchen table for the first time, all four of them. Because Burl ate with the household on Saturday evenings, as was the established custom, and James talked without stopping for approximately 40 minutes about horses and knots, and the cat, and the walk up the ridge, and what he thought the ranch needed, which included a dog and possibly some chickens. Colt answered his questions with the patient seriousness of a man who understood that a child's opinions deserved actual responses. And Burl occasionally interjected with commentary that was just dry enough to make Clara press her lips together to hide her reaction. And the kitchen was warm, and the food was plain and sufficient, and outside the mountains were going purple in the evening light. After James was settled in the loft, Clara sat at the kitchen table while Colt cleared up, and they were quiet together in the way they'd developed over Thursday and Friday mornings. The comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill space. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow, we wait for Harrington to confirm Monday's arrangements," he said. "And we stay off the road from town." "Denton," she said. "Won't come up here tonight," Colt said. "He's too careful to make a move without a plan." But by tomorrow evening, he'll have talked to someone." He set a cup of coffee in front of her and took the other chair. "Ainton thinks Fitch will fold the moment the review is formally initiated. The Alcott connection alone, enough to make Fitch's position untenable." "Alcott," Clara said. "You know him, Harrington does. He's been connected to fraudulent estate documents before. Name on a will in this territory is effectively a signature that something is wrong." He looked at her. "I believe Thomas never signed a will that looked anything like the one Denton produced." Clara was very still. "You think Denton manufactured it?" she said. "Yeah. I think Denton identified an opportunity when his brother died, without having drawn up proper legal documents," Colt said carefully, "and that he found people willing to help him take advantage of that opportunity. That's what I think happened." Clara stared at the table for a long moment. Her hands were around the coffee cup, and her face was doing something complicated and private. "Thomas trusted him," she said. "They weren't close, but Thomas trusted him. He was family." She pressed her lips together. It would be she stopped. Started again. He would be so angry. Colt said. "He would." She looked up at him. "How do you know what Thomas would feel? You never met him." "Any man who loved you the way you describe would be," Colt said simply. She held his gaze for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. "You talk about him like he was real," she said. "Most people don't." "Most people just they move past it. He was real," Colt said. "Mattered to you. That makes him matter in the room." Merritt was quiet for a long time. Then she said very softly, "I'm going to be all right." It wasn't a question. It was something she was saying to hear herself say it. Colt said, "You are." She looked at him, this direct, honest, unguarded look. "You're sure?" she said. "I've been sure since the first morning," he said. Yay. Something moved in her face, the last of the brace giving way, the final held tension releasing, the thing she'd been protecting so long that she'd nearly forgotten what it looked like unprotected. She was not a woman who cried easily. He'd noticed that the control she had over herself, but her eyes went bright, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth for just a second. "Colt, Clara," he said. "Yeah." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, the coffee cooling between them, mountains going fully dark outside. Everything that was going to happen, next Durango and Harrington, and the fraudulent will, and Denton's accounting, and the long work of building something real from the wreckage of what had been all of it, was still ahead of them, all of it still to be done. Nay, but in this kitchen, in this moment, it was just two people who had found each other across a broken landscape and decided quietly, stubbornly, to stay. "What happens on Monday," Clara said, "whatever comes out of it, I want you to know that I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm here because I chose this. I chose to be here." Colt held her gaze and felt the full weight of what she was saying settle into him like something permanent. "I know," he said. "Good," she said. "I wanted to say it." He smiled, a real one, the kind he didn't deploy often. "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning things," she said. He got up to refill the coffee, and she let him, and they sat together until the lamp burned low, talking about small things, the ranch, James's education. The chickens that James had apparently already decided were a foregone conclusion, and the night was warm, and the mountains were still, and outside a mockingbird ran through its repertoire one last time, before going quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, the quiet was not something that needed to be survived. It was just the end of a day, and tomorrow was something they would handle together. Monday came in hard. Colt was at the fence line before sunrise, working, because working was the only thing that kept his mind from running every possible version of Monday's events in Durango into the ground. He had done the planning. Harrington had the documents. Fitch had already indicated his willingness to cooperate. Pieces were in place. There was nothing left to do except let tomorrow come. It was always the hardest part. He heard the horse before he saw it not a ranch horse, not Burl's easy amble through the property. This was a hard ride up the ridge, fast and deliberate. He set down the fencing tool and turned. Denton Aldridge came over the crest of the road at a pace that meant he had not spent Sunday morning being careful. He had a man with him, not the two from Friday, just one, riding slightly behind. Denton pulled up hard when he saw Colt standing at the fence line, and the horse danced under him with the nerves of an animal that had been pushed too fast. Colt did not move toward him. He stood where he was and waited. "Where is she?" Denton said. "Good morning to you too," Colt said. Denton got down from his horse. The man behind him stayed mounted. "She left my household with my ward," Denton said. "Yeah, I want her back, and I want the boy back, and I want you to understand that I will be taking this to Sheriff Greer this morning." "That's your right," Colt said. "Greer will tell you that Clara Aldridge is a free adult who can reside wherever she chooses, and that, without a court order, which you do not have, James stays where his mother puts him." "I have a will. You have a document with George Alcott's name on it," Colt said. Quietly, and he said it clearly, and he watched it land, the way he'd watched the Durango mention land 2 days ago, like a stone into still water, the ripples moving outward in every direction. Denton's face went through 3 things fast: shock, recalculation, fury. "You don't know what you're talking about. Alcott and Patterson," Colt said. "Witnesses to Thomas Aldridge's will." "Except Thomas Aldridge never drew up a will, did he, Denton? He died before he got around to it, and you saw an opportunity. He kept his voice level, the way he kept it when the weather was going bad, and panicking would only make it worse. Fitch has already agreed to meet with my attorney in Durango tomorrow morning." He used the word irregularities. "I think you know what that means." The man on the horse behind Denton shifted his weight. Denton stared at Colt for a long moment. He was calculating Colt could see it happening, the same cold intelligence that had organized 18 months of systematic control being turned on a problem that had gotten away from him. He was looking for the angle, looking for the leverage point. "That document is legal," Denton said. "Then you'll have no trouble defending it in front of a territorial judge," Colt said. "Monday, Durango. Harrington has already filed the review petition." Denton stopped. "Saturday afternoon," Colt said. After Fitch responded, the color that came into Denton's face was not the slow-building red of his usual anger. It was something paler and more dangerous. "You've been planning this since." "Since I understood what was happening in that house," Colt said. Denton took 2 steps forward. The man on the horse moved forward with him. Colt stood his ground at the fence line, tools within reach, and met Denton's eyes without any particular expression. "You think this is over?" Denton said. His voice was very quiet now. "You think a water rights filing and a lawyer from Denver is going to end this? I have been in this territory for 20 years. I know every judge and every marshal and every man who matters between here and Santa Fe." "You've been here 6 months, 7, Colt said. "You're nobody," Denton said. Colt looked at him steadily. "You rode up to my property on a Sunday morning to tell me that," he said. "I think you believe the opposite." The silence stretched. From behind Colt, the ranch house door opened. Clara came out, walked across the yard to stand beside Colt. Not behind him. Beside him, with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her eyes on Denton. She was wearing her work clothes and her hair was in its practical bun, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had gotten up this morning in a place she had chosen and had no intention of leaving. Denton looked at her. Something complicated and ugly moved through his expression. "Clara, this is not what Thomas would have wanted." "You don't get to use Thomas's name," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "Not to me, not ever again. I took you in when you had nothing. Manufactured a document that gave you legal authority over me and my son," she said. "That's not taking someone in, that's a trap." She held his gaze. "Know the difference now." Denton's jaw tightened. "You can't prove that," she said, "and he will." Yeah, because protecting his license matters more to him than protecting you. The man on the horse behind Denton was very still. Denton looked between Clara and Colt, and for the first time since Colt had met him, looked like what he actually was, a man who has run a long, confident scheme and come around a corner to find the wall he'd been heading toward all along. "This will cost you," he said finally, to both of them. No one to the air. "Send your attorney to Durango Monday morning," Colt said. "That's where this gets settled. Not on my property on a Sunday." Denton stood for one more long moment. "Yeah." Then he turned and went back to a horse and mounted, and the man with him turned with the relieved efficiency of someone who'd been hoping for exactly this outcome, and they rode back down the ridge without another word. Clara and Colt stood in the yard and watched them go. "Men." She let out a breath. It was not a shaky breath, it was the breath of a runner who has finished a long race and is only now letting the exertion show. She had held herself together for the entire confrontation with a control that he found, if he was being completely honest, remarkable. "He's going to get an attorney," she said. "Yes," Colt said. "And that attorney is going to talk to Fitch." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. And then, Colt said, "Whatever the will actually says or doesn't say comes out in front of a judge, and Denton has to account for it." She looked at him. "You're not worried." "I'm always worried," he said. "Yeah, that's different from being afraid." She looked at him for a moment longer with that measuring look she'd been giving him since the first morning. He turned and went back to the house and paused at the door. "James is making breakfast," she said. "He found the eggs." "Aren't supposed to put eggs," Colt said. "We don't have chickens." "I know," she said. "He found them anyway." A pause. "Burl may have acquired chickens without mentioning it." She went inside. Colt stood in the yard for a moment longer, looking at the road Denton had taken back toward town. Felt the settled weight of a man who has done what he could do and now has to let the rest run its course. Went inside to find out about the chickens. Nate arrived, the way important days always do, with the appearance of an ordinary morning, sun coming up the same as always. Ranch sounds unchanged. James eating breakfast and talking about the gray horse's apparent preference for carrots over apples, which he had been scientifically testing. Colt, Clara, and Harrington rode to Durango. Burl stayed with James. This was James's least favorite part of the arrangement, expressed through a sequence of negotiating positions that eventually concluded with Burl promising to teach him how to properly saddle the gray horse while they were gone. At which point James became substantially more amenable. The ride to Durango took 2 hours. To get, though, over what to expect, the sequence of the meeting, what Fitch was likely to say and how to respond to it, the questions the reviewing officer would ask. Clara sat straight in the wagon and listened and asked good, precise questions, and Colt drove and let Harrington do his work. When they arrived at Fitch's office, a man was already waiting outside. Not Fitch. A younger man, a clerk, with the look of someone who has been sent ahead to deliver news before the principals have to face each other. "Mr. Harrington," the clerk said. "Yes," Harrington said. "Mr. Fitch asked me to let you know," the clerk said, "that he has prepared a full statement regarding the Aldridge estate document." The clerk chose the next word carefully. "He is prepared to be entirely forthcoming." Harrington looked at Colt. Colt looked at Clara. "Forthcoming," Harrington said. "Yes, sir." "Well then," Harrington said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite satisfaction, but was its close neighbor. "Let's go in." What Fitch's statement contained was worse than Colt had anticipated and precisely what he'd suspected. Thomas Aldridge had died in January of 1881 without having drawn up a will. This was the simple, straightforward truth that Denton had identified immediately upon his brother's death as an opportunity. Thomas had discussed a will with Fitch's office on one occasion, 6 months before his death, but had not followed through on the appointment to execute it. There were notes. There were the intentions Thomas had expressed, which included leaving everything to Clara and James, with no mention of Denton whatsoever. What Denton had done was commission a will. He He had used Alcott and Patterson men, with records of participating in such arrangements to witness a document that Thomas Aldrich had never signed, that contained terms Thomas Aldrich had never expressed. And that had been executed by Fitch under circumstances that Fitch now described in writing as having been obtained through significant pressure and the implied threat of consequences that Fitch declined to specify, but that Harrington noted carefully. Denton had then presented this document to a widow with a 4-year-old child, in a vulnerable moment, with a lawyer present to confirm its legitimacy. Clara sat in Fitch's office and listened to all of this read out in Harrington's careful professional voice and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said what Thomas wanted. You said there were notes. Fitch looked uncomfortable, which was the appropriate response for a man in his position. There are notes from our consultation, he said. His expressed intentions were clear. He wanted the property and everything held in his name to go to you and your son. He mentioned that he would like James to have the freedom to pursue an education. He mentioned that he wanted you financially independent, not dependent on anyone. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She was not shaking. He said that, she said. He said financially independent. Those are the notes, Fitch said. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up at Colt. Her eyes were very bright, the specific brightness of someone holding back something too large for a lawyer's office. Thomas had known what she needed. He'd been going to make sure she had it. And then he'd died in January before he could, and Denton had walked into the space that left. Colt held her gaze and let her see that he understood. Harrington was already writing. The property and assets held in Thomas Aldrich's name, he said. What does that constitute precisely? What it constituted, as it turned out, was considerably more than Clara had known. The Aldrich land holdings, the house on Sycamore Lane and 2 adjoining lots, were held in Thomas's name and had passed, by intestate succession law, to his surviving spouse and child. Denton's manufactured will had obscured this fact, but with the will invalidated, the succession was straightforward. The house was Clara's. It had been, legally, since January of 1881. Harrington confirmed this with the reviewing officer and had it notarized before noon. Way on the road back to Cedar Ridge by 1 o'clock. The first half hour nobody said much. Harrington reviewed his documents. The road ran alongside the creek that fed down from the mountains, quick and cold in summer. Sat beside Colt on the wagon bench and looked at the mountains. It took 2 years from us, she said finally. Yes, Colt said. James and I have been living in our own house, she said. The whole time, our own house. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. I want to be angry, she said. I'm trying to locate the anger and I can find it, but underneath it is, she stopped. Looked at her hands, relief, which feels wrong. To be relieved when you've just found out how badly you were wronged. Not wrong, Colt said. Relief that it's over is just what relief is. She looked at him. You could have told me earlier, she said. You suspected the will was fraudulent. You could have said so. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He kept his eyes on the road. Because suspecting it and proving it are different things, and I wasn't going to tell you the cage might be locked when I wasn't sure I could get the key. He paused. That seemed like the crueler thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stopped. What considered, she said. You're a very considered man. I've been told that, he said. Usually by people who found it frustrating. I don't find it frustrating, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the road, with a small curve to her mouth, the almost smile that had been gradually becoming an actual smile over the past weeks. What are you going to do, he said, with the house? Yeah. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. I don't know yet, she said. I know I'm not going back to live in it. Not yet, maybe not ever. She paused. Mabel's sister has been looking for lodging. I could rent it, use the income. She glanced at him. Give myself that financial independence Thomas wanted me to have. That's a good plan, he said. I'm a planner, she said. He smiled. She'd turned his words back on him, and she knew it, and she was pleased with herself about it in the dry, precise way she had. There's still Denton, Colt said. Yes, she said. There's still Denton, Inchin. Harrington, from the back of the wagon, said without looking up from his papers. The Territorial Marshal's office will be interested in what came out of this morning's meeting. Fraud in the execution of an estate document is a serious charge. Alcott has an existing record. Patterson will cooperate when he understands the alternative. He turned a page. Denton Aldridge is going to have considerably more pressing concerns than Mrs. Aldridge's living arrangements within the week. Clara absorbed this. He'll face charges, she said. Almost certainly, Harrington said. She sat with that for a moment. Good, she said. It was a quiet word, not triumphant, just the word of someone who has watched a wrong persist for too long and is glad to see it corrected. H drove the wagon and let the afternoon sun and the mountain air do their work, and, by the time Cedar Ridge appeared in the valley below them, something in the wagon had shifted something lighter and more durable. The feeling of people who have come through the hardest part of something and are beginning to see the other side. Word traveled through Cedar Ridge, the way word always traveled through small towns, fast and imprecise, and with a momentum that nobody could quite stop once it started moving. By Tuesday morning, enough of the outline had gotten around the fraudulent will, Itch's statement, the Territorial Review, that the conversations on Main Street had changed their shape. People who had made the collective agreement to look the other way were now making a different collective agreement. The one where they had always privately known something was wrong with the Aldridge situation, and were relieved someone had finally done something about it. Mabel Pruitt, who had the advantage of actually knowing what had happened, was precise and accurate in her corrections of the less precise versions circulating around her. And she did it with the quiet, righteous satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for this particular moment for a long time. Sheriff Greer came to find Colt on Tuesday afternoon. He came alone, without the considered neutrality of his previous interactions, and he had the look of a man who has made a decision about something. The marshal's office has been in contact, he said. Denton Aldridge, I heard Colt said. Greer was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ranch house, at the mending room window where Clara was visible at work, at the barn where James's voice was audible talking to Burl. I should have acted sooner, he said, not to Colt specifically. Or to himself, not unkindly. Greer nodded once, for what it's worth. You handled it right. Clara handled it right, Colt said. I just provided some of the tools. Greer looked at him for a moment with an expression that was assessment and something close to respect. Then he touched his hat brim and rode back toward town. Denton Aldridge was arrested on Wednesday by two men from the Territorial Marshal's office who arrived from Durango with papers and a demeanor that indicated they'd been waiting for something to come together on this particular for a while. He did not make a scene. He went with them quietly, which Colt thought was probably the smartest thing the man had done in years. His two associates from the freighting operation were brought in for questioning regarding the witnesses to the fraudulent will, and Patterson, exactly as Harrington had predicted, cooperated within the first hour. Cedar Ridge, which had been collectively holding its breath, let it out. Clara heard about the arrest from Mabel, who sent a note up the ridge with the errand boy. She read it at the kitchen table, set it down and sat very still for a moment. Then she went back to the shirt she'd been mending. Jolt watched her from the doorway. All right, he said. Yes, she said. She kept her eyes on the shirt. I feel like I should feel more. Some kind of resolution, a full stop. She pulled a stitch tight. Mostly I just feel tired. That's what resolution actually feels like, he said. It's not a trumpet, it's just stopping being afraid. She looked up at him then, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded he'd ever seen from her stripped of the companionment and the practiced stillness, just Clara. 34 years old, tired and relieved and present. I'm not afraid, she said. Right now in this moment I am not afraid. He said. She held his gaze. How long do you think it lasts? I think, he said, that it gets easier to get back to, once you've been there. She considered this. Then she went back to the shirt, and he came and sat down across from her, and they worked she on the mending, he on the ranch accounts that had been accumulating in the comfortable quiet of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and find them agreeable. 3 weeks after the arrest, Harrington confirmed that the fraudulent will had been formally invalidated by the territorial court. The Aldridge house on Sycamore Lane was clear in Clara's name, along with the 2 adjoining lots and the remaining contents of the estate, after Denton's legal situation had stripped the freighting operation. It was not a fortune, but it was something real and hers, and nobody could touch it. Mabel's sister moved into the Sycamore Lane house in August, paying a fair monthly rent that went directly into the account Harrington had helped Clara establish at the Cedar Ridge Bank. James started school in September. He came home every day with the particular energized exhaustion of a child who has found the right environment. Talking about everything he'd learned and everything he wanted to know, and several things his teacher had said that he thought were wrong and wanted to debate. Colt listened to all of it with the patient seriousness that James had come to count on, and occasionally offered counter-arguments that kept the debate interesting. And Clara watched them across the dinner table and felt something settle into her bones that she hadn't felt since Thomas, the specific warmth of a table where everyone present wanted to be there. She had not officially moved to the ranch. She maintained, technically, the fiction of lodging in town, staying with Mabel on the nights she wasn't up the ridge. Cedar Ridge itself had relaxed considerably on the question of what the widow Aldridge was doing and who she was doing it with. In the way that small towns do when the scandal is resolved and the person at the center of it has turned out to be the wronged party all along. People nodded to her on the street now, said good morning and meant it, asked after James. Mabel, predictably, was not fooled by the fiction for a single moment. "You spend 4 nights a week at the ranch," Mabel said one evening in early October, with the mild tone of a woman stating a fact. "I help with the household," Clara said. Mabel said. "Mending is considerable," Clara said. Mabel said again. Clara pressed her lips together. "Mabel." "I'm not saying a word," Mabel said. "You're saying an enormous amount without words," Clara said. Mabel smiled into her tea. "I just think," she said, "that a man who sets up a mending room with a good east window has intentions that go beyond the mending." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't said anything," she said. And there was in those 4 words a whole conversation, the thing she'd been holding for weeks, the awareness that had been building in her with the slow inevitability of a Colorado sunrise. What she felt for Colt Briggs was not gratitude, and was not partnership, and was not the comfortable warmth of friendship, or not only those things. Mabel set down her tea. "Clara," she said gently, "has he given you any reason to think he doesn't intend to say something?" Clara thought about every moment, since that first morning, on the porch. Every considered word and every deliberate choice. A room with the east window, the held-back leverage. The way he said her name, the way he listened, patience that was not passivity but strategy, and the way that strategy had been, from the beginning, aimed entirely at giving her back to herself. "No," she said. Then maybe Mabel said, "You could say something." She went up the ridge that evening, instead of staying in town. Colt was at the kitchen table when she came in, going over the fall cattle plans, and he looked up when she came through the door with the specific attention he always gave her, not just registering her presence but actually looking at her. The habit of a man who had decided she was worth looking at carefully. "Nan, thought you were staying with Mabel tonight," he said. "I changed my mind," she said. She came and sat down across from him. He set down his papers. They looked at each other in the lamplight with the ease of people who had been doing this for months and the particular heightened awareness of people who know something is about to shift. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said in March," she said. "When I asked you why you were doing all of it, you said, because nobody else was doing it and that seemed wrong." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think it's true. I also think it's not the whole truth." He was very still. "No," he said, "it's not the whole truth. What's the rest of it? She said. He looked at her for a long moment, this steady, honest, direct look. You want me to say it out loud? He said. I think it would be useful, she said. He was quiet for just a beat, the kind of beat that was not hesitation but wait. I watched you on that porch with your head against a post, he said, and I couldn't ride past it. I've told you that. But the reason I couldn't ride past it, he paused. It wasn't principle, it was, but it was also that you were the most. He stopped and tried again. I have ridden through a lot of towns in 20 years. I have met a lot of people. I have not once turned my horse around for any of them. He looked at her steadily. Turned around for you. Clara's hands were still on the table. She was not shaking, she was not counting. She was just looking at him with the full weight of her attention, the way she did when something mattered enough to deserve it. Colt, she said. Clara, he said. I am not the same woman who was standing on that porch, she said. I have a house in my name and money in a bank account, and a son who is learning to saddle a horse, and I am not afraid of Denton Aldridge or Cedar Ridge or any of the things that I was afraid of in March. She paused. Yeah. I want you to understand that when I say what I'm going to say, I'm saying it as someone who doesn't need you to say it back. All right, he said. I love you, she said. I have been probably, since you made a room with a good east window, and didn't tell me what to do with it. She kept her voice steady and her eyes on his. Yeah, and I'm not telling you that because I need something from you. I'm telling you because it's true, and I'm tired of knowing true things and not saying them. The kitchen was very quiet. Colt looked at her across the table, this woman who had walked out of a house with a carpetbag and her chin up and rebuilt herself from the bones out while he'd been privileged enough to watch it happen. And he felt the full settled certain weight of what he was about to say before he said it. Clara, he said, I have been in love with you since the first morning. Yeah, I've just been waiting until you had enough ground under your feet that I wasn't saying it into thin air. She let out a breath. It was the same breath she'd let out after Denton's Sunday visit, the breath of a runner who has finished the race, except that this time there was something underneath it, something warm and bright and deeply, quietly certain. That's very considerate of you, she said. I'm a considered man, he said. I know, she said. I find it useful. Yeah. He got up from the table and came around it, and she stood to meet him, and he took both her hands in his the first time he'd held her hands, though it felt like the natural continuation of every conversation they'd ever had, and looked at her. What do you want, he said. Not what makes sense. Not what's practical. What do you want? She looked up at him. I want to stay, she said. I want James to grow up on this ridge. Want the mending room with the east window to be mine. I want to eat dinner at this table for the rest of my life. She paused. And I want to say all of that is a choice, not a necessity. It is a choice, he said. It's always been a choice. I know, she said. That's why I'm making it. He held her hands, and she let him. And outside the mountains were enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way they always were. And the summer that had started with a woman on a porch counting in French had come around to this kitchen and this table and these two people choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were doing, to stay. He asked her in December, on a morning when the first real snow had come down from the peaks and James had gone outside before breakfast to investigate it with the thoroughness of a child conducting important scientific work. He asked her at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd said everything else that mattered, because it seemed right to ask her there. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't a man for speeches. He took a ring from his shirt pocket, a plain band, the kind you could work in, the kind that meant something because it didn't need to be anything elaborate, and set it on the table in front of her. I'd like you to marry me, he said, if you're willing. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about March and the porch, and the mockingbird, and a man who hadn't ridden past. She thought about the room with the east window and the 50 cents a day that had been a ladder and not a rescue. She thought about a fraudulent will and a territorial judge and money in a bank account in her name and a gray horse that her son considered a personal friend. She thought about Thomas, who had wanted her to be independent, understood, with the certainty of someone who has thought about something long enough to know the truth of it, that Thomas would have liked Colt Briggs enormously. She picked up the ring, simply, completely. He put it on her finger and held her hand for a moment, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Because everything had already been said at the kitchen table over months of coffee and lamplight and the slow, deliberate building of something true. James came in from the snow 30 seconds later, stamping his boots and radiating cold air, and the information that there was enough snow for a proper snowman if anyone was interested, and stopped when he saw their faces. He looked at the ring. He looked at Colt. He looked at his mother. "Does this mean," he said slowly, "that Mr. Briggs is going to stay?" "He was always staying," Clara said. James absorbed this with the pragmatic clarity of a 9-year-old who has been paying attention. "Can I call him something other than Mr. Briggs?" he said. Colt looked at the boy. This boy who had pressed himself against a fence slat with a split lip, saying "I fell." This boy who had learned to coil a rope and argue with his teacher and tell a gray horse his opinions. "That's up to you," he said. James thought about for approximately 4 seconds. "Okay," he said, and went to get the snow gear he needed for the snowman, because the most important things were also, sometimes, the simplest ones. Looked at Colt. Colt looked at Clara. Outside, the snow was coming down across the North Ridge, and the mountains were white and enormous, and the ranch was warm, and the table was set for 3, and the life that had seemed impossible in March was simply, undeniably, here. There was no moment when the mountain felt lonely anymore. There was no room in the house that was untouched or empty or cold. There was a woman who had walked out of a broken place with her chin up and her son's hand in hers, and a man who had turned his horse around, and between them something had been built that neither of them could have constructed alone. Not a rescue, a choice. Made every morning, by both of them, with full knowledge and clear eyes, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be anything other than what it is, steady, honest, and absolutely certain that it has found the place it belongs. That was the truth of the North Ridge. That was the truth of Cedar Ridge, once the fog of fear and fraud and enforced silence had been cleared away. That was the truth of a woman who had been told she was nothing, and a man who had never believed it for a single moment. 2 people who had been broken by different things, in different ways, had found each other on a road in the summer of 1883. They had chosen every day since to stay. And the mountains indifferent to everything, except what endured held them, as the mountains always hold the things that are built to last, without ceremony, without condition, and without any intention of letting go.